We'd just like to welcome you today to the World Animal Protection and Zoocheck's Wild Among Us webinar series addressing exotic animal issues pertaining to the trade, regulation, seizure, and sheltering of exotic animals as pets and the associated animal welfare, public health and safety, and environmental risks that are apparent in that process. Thank you for joining us. We're very happy that you're here, and good morning or good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Cassandra Conan, and I'm the global head of the wildlife campaign for exotic pets here at World Animal Protection, and I'll be moderating today's session for you. Zoocheck and World Animal Protection are two organizations working on exotic pets issues here in Canada and around the world. World Animal Protection is a global charity, and our mission is to move the world to protect animals. Using evidence-based research, we expose animal welfare issues and work collaboratively with a range of stakeholders like yourselves to identify and deliver positive and sustainable change. Our vision is a world where animals live free from cruelty and suffering. Zoocheck is a Canadian-based international wildlife protection charity established in 1984 to promote and protect the interests and well-being of wild animals free roaming in nature and those held in captivity. Working with a broad range of collaborating partners across Canada and around the world, Zoocheck endeavors to promote animal protection in specific situations and strives to bring about a new respect for all living things in the world in which we live. So we have a great lineup of speakers for you today over the next few hours, and you'll notice along the bottom of your screen, and some of you have already found it, a button that says Q&A. Please click here if you have any questions for our speakers, and we'll be taking questions for about 10 minutes after each speaker, and then if there's time at the end and our speakers are still on, and we're happy to take some more. And I also wanted to let you know that we will be taking a stretch break after the second speaker for about 10 minutes, just so you can grab a drink or do whatever. So let's, with no further ado, let's kick off the session. Our first speaker is Michele Hamers. Michele has a BSc in Animal Husbandry and Welfare and a Master's of Science in Animal Biology and Welfare, and is a member of the Royal Society of Biology and a designated European professional biologist. She's been working in the animal welfare field for almost a decade and is an expert on captive wildlife issues. During the past 5 years, she's been focusing on reptile behavior and welfare, and as World Animal Protection's Wildlife Campaign Manager and one of my fun colleagues, she's responsible for exotic pet welfare for work here in Canada and oversees the organization's Wildlife Not Pets campaign. Her main goal is to increase visibility and spread awareness around exotic pet trade here in Canada. And with her research background, Michele strongly believes that independent peer-reviewed scientific data must be the foundation for advancing animal welfare work. And she's excited to work with local partners and governments and businesses to find practical ways to prevent animal suffering worldwide. So Michele, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cass. Let me see if this presentation can move. Oh. There we go. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to talk to you all today. My presentation today, an introduction to exotic pet issues in Canada. As Cass said, I'm the campaign manager at World Animal Protection, and I'm responsible for our work on exotic pets. So a little bit about the campaign. We have a three-pronged approach to the Wildlife Not Pets campaign. We focus on working with governments and companies in order to change policies and increase the protection for exotic pets in the pet industry. And we also do work in public education. This is all in order to reduce accessibility and acceptability, and we focus on all parts of the trade chain. So from the supply to the moment of purchase. Our goal is to protect the animals within the trade and to prevent new animals from entering the trade. So what do we know about the exotic pet industry? There is quite a bit, and over time we've learned more. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it affects millions of animals each year. Canada participates. We export and import and breed exotic pets for the industry. And you might be thinking of the, as we call them, charismatic animals. But looking at the current exotic pet industry, the animals that are mostly affected are birds, reptiles, and amphibians and fishes. We also realize that there's a lack of federal and provincial and municipal regulations and oversight, and that the trade is growing. What are the risks that are inherent to the exotic pet trade? As working for an animal welfare organizations, we are severely concerned with the animal health and welfare impacts of every stage of the trade chain. While mortality rates vary in the literature, the sheer number of animals being traded every year for the exotic pet trade means that even a 1% mortality rate would impact likely millions of animals. Other issues that have come to light that are part of the trade is the human health and safety. As we know, conferences like these have been moved online because of COVID. And as we've seen with COVID and SARS, the interaction between people and wildlife can have disastrous consequences. Also, a major issue in the trade is that there is a very gray area where legal and the illegal trade intersect, which makes it very difficult for enforcement officers to recognize animals that are being transported legally or illegally or sold illegally or illegally. Lastly, some things to pay attention to is that when it comes to education and the spread of information on how these animals must be kept, varies greatly if you look at the internet or any resources. And this is problematic because standards are often not necessarily related to animals live in the wild, but by experiences that have gathered from exotic pet breeding and exotic pet keeping. And other speakers will be talking more about this. So a little bit about definitions before moving into more details about the research that we've conducted. Because there is some confusion about definitions in general, what are wild animals or what are considered domesticated animals. In this case, when I'm talking about exotic pets, or we as an organization talk about exotic pets, we mean wild animals who have been domesticated and that are not native, in this case, to Canada. The reason why we are focusing on exotic pets and not, in this case, wildlife in general, is that because in Canada, in most jurisdictions, the keeping of wild animals that are native to a province, territory, or to Canada is prohibited. And if you think about it, it's a great contradiction because for some reason, we cannot keep our own wildlife as pets, but we are okay or we are allowed to keep wildlife from other countries as pets. One more thing I'd like to point out of this slide is the definition around domesticated animals. It is important to note that domestication must occur to a group of animals. So it cannot be one single animal that is domesticated merely because it has been born in captivity. Usually there is thousands of years that have to occur with specific breeding of traits in order to make an animal domesticated. However, it is also important to notice that domestication might not occur in certain types of animals. And while the mechanics around domestication might not be understood quite well, it is thought that some species, for example, dogs, were predisposed in some way to become domesticated and that other animals don't have this predisposition, which means that some animals, no matter how long they would be in captivity, cannot be domesticated. All right, so moving on, the composition of the exotic pet trade and how exotic pets ends up in our Canadian homes. So when COVID started, we realized that we knew very little how animals end up from abroad and how they enter our country. And this is an important section of the exotic pet trade. We know that at municipal and provincial level, many things are being attempted to regulate the trade. But in the end of the day, if animals are still coming in from other countries, it's something that needs to be addressed as well. The wildlife trade in itself has many facets, and Canada participates in almost all of them. This includes trophy hunting, the fur industry, wildlife farming, and the exotic pet trade. As I mentioned, import, export, breeding, and the use of exotic pets. So we did some research and we talked to many people in the past months about what happens at the border. So what we've realized is that there are three agencies that are responsible for letting animals into the country. We have the Canadian Border Services Agency, which falls under the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. We have the Canadian Wildlife Services, which falls under Environment Canada. And then we have the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which falls under Public Health or Health Canada. So as you already might have noticed, all these agencies fall under different governmental departments and ministries, which makes it more complex. When an animal enters or comes at our border, the gatekeepers are the people that work for CBSA. But as you can imagine, they have many other things to look at, including drugs trafficking, human trafficking, etc. So animals might not be their priority. Furthermore, the CBSA will only flag shipments of animals according to CWS or CFIA guidelines and standards, which means that any animal that does not fall under these standards will not be flagged by the Canadian Border Services Agency. So for example, when we talk about the role Canadian Wildlife Services plays, it pertains only to animals that are listed according to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, also known as CITES. Unfortunately, there are only 6,000 animal species listed under CITES. To give you an example, all the mammal species in the world tally up to about 6,000 animal species. This means that the majority of animals are not covered by this international convention. So if an animal does not fall under the permit requirements of the CWS, the second option is that they might fall under the CFIA. However, the mandate of the CFIA is to look at health concerns related to the food system, to the human food system. So they look mainly at agricultural animals that come across the border, other animals that are used for farming, including wildlife farming. But as you can see, pets don't really fit under that mandate. And that's where we see a gap in regulation. So for example, I'll move on to the next slide. What we've seen in our studies is that the CFIA does not look at amphibians and reptiles in general. They only look at turtles and tortoises because back in the 80s, there was an increase in salmonella cases related to turtle and tortoises, and therefore they took action by requiring health certificates before these animals can be imported, and usually these animals cannot be imported for pet purposes. And the same happened with salamanders. There are certain restrictions due to a disease that they can carry and can decimate local populations. So back to the data that we found. Unfortunately, we also requested data from 2014 to 2019 to provide you with a wider view on what the pet trade looks like, but we don't have that information just yet. It wasn't ready in time for this presentation. Anyhow, we do have information about 2019, and over 320,000 wild animals were imported into Canada. It is estimated that only 1 to 2% of these animals are subject to the CITES agreement, so subject to Canadian Wildlife Services. And then another 3 to 4% of animals are subject to CFIA. So you see the majority of animals that are imported are not subject to any permits, health certificates, or any control. What we found is that the purpose of importation was mainly for the exotic pet industry. So about 80% of animals were flagged as being imported for pet purposes. And the majority were reptiles and amphibians. So you can see where there's a major gap already at the border before even the animals are entering our country. So once the animals are in our country, it's the responsibility of provinces and territories to regulate them. We have a cruelty code, which applies federally, but the majority of issues related to animal and animal welfare will be solved within our provinces and territories. In 2019, we conducted an analysis of all the provinces and territories and their acts and regulations pertaining to exotic pets. We found some results that were not surprising to us. First is the focus on human safety. So this is where mostly big mammals like tigers and elephants and other animals that are maybe on top of mind when thinking about wildlife are prohibited to be kept based on mostly human safety grounds because of the possibility of these animals to physically injure you. However, there is a gap there because there is little consideration for the disease transmission. And I'll be repeating this more often in my presentation. But for example, reptiles and amphibians all carry salmonella. And as the CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, admitted, is that it's a public health risk because they have now installed limitations on the importation due to these animals, turtles and tortoises, carrying salmonella. Why they haven't done this with other reptiles and amphibians, it's unknown. What we've also found is that there's, which is a good thing, an increasing focus on the protection of local environments. So focusing on those exotic pets that could perhaps establish themselves as invasive species in Canada. An example is the controlled alien species regulations in British Columbia, who within their mandate, they look at animals that are a risk to human safety, as well as animals that could potentially establish themselves within the province. There's a heavy focus on mammals within those prohibitions of keeping of exotic pets. Again, because it's linked to human safety. So historically, all these regulation and acts were established to protect people from being physically injured. This means that reptiles, birds, amphibians, fishes are typically poorly represented in the provincial and territorial acts and regulations. Finally, we've found that breeding and sales of exotic pets is mostly legal and usually unregulated. And Ontario is probably the most famous and easy example to provide. Last year, they introduced, or in January of this year, a new act came into place, the Provincial Animal Welfare Services Act, which was a great move from the government. However, there are still no regulations that regulate that consider any restrictions of the keeping of exotic pets or the sales or the breeding. This means that municipalities are responsible for creating their own bylaws that will prohibit or restrict the keeping or sales or breeding of these animals. And whereas the big animals, again, tigers, wolves, lions, etc., are considered in those bans, most of the small species are completely forgotten. So how do people get these animals? Well, I think this is of no surprise to anybody. We have our pet stores with a storefront. You can think of PetSmart, who is still selling reptiles and amphibians. But I think a majority of the sales has moved online. And this is because many of these breeders, especially if we're looking at reptile breeders, and even sometimes bird breeders, they don't require a lot of space to set up their operations. So it means they can have 10, 20 or more animals in their house and nobody will ever know. And they sell their animals on Facebook and forums, on Kijiji, etc. Also, people can purchase animals from non-Canadian platforms. For example, this website listed here, which is a US-based exotic animal website where you can buy any animal you can think of. We've discovered, well, not we, I have to give kudos to my amazing volunteers. They have identified over 300 reptile breeders in Canada currently, and that's only based on a simple Facebook and Google search. We've also identified approximately 20 exotic bird breeders in the country. So the numbers are quite significant. And then if we're moving on to another acquisition channel and an emerging trend, are reptile expos and pet shows. So last year, we've counted that about 20 reptile expo or pet expo events took place across the country. And these places can be considered wildlife markets. It's places where wild animals like reptiles and birds are being sold to the public or enthusiasts or breeders, and is accessible to anybody. So this is just to break up the text. You know how pet stores look like. On the right, you see, for example, how PetSmart displays their reptiles. We can't ignore fishes. They are a huge part of the exotic pet trade. It might not be the main focus now, but they are wild animals, and they should receive greater consideration than what they have now. Some research that we've been conducting and are still conducting are online platforms. So we've looked at Kijiji for the past 6 months, and I see some of the text might have fallen off, or just the colors changed a bit. But in the past 6 months, from January of this year to June, we found 58,000 ads on Kijiji that offered live animals for sale. And as you can see, Ontario and Quebec are leaders, unfortunately. Without that, it's not very surprising. And mostly reptiles or birds are being sold. As you can see, reptiles are quite popular in Ontario. And what I'll show you later is that actually this graph corresponds with the findings we had when we looked into where these animals are being kept. So whereas most animals seem to be sold in Ontario, most people, or like majority of exotic pets, are also kept in Ontario. So it's an interesting correlation there. Moving on, reptile expos. And next week, Neil de Cruz will tell you more about these types of events. I just wanted to add some pictures and show you about some of the concerns that we have with these expos. As you can see here, this is a common way how these animals are kept during the period of these events. They are kept in very small tanks, containers. In this case, the animals cannot stretch their legs. It must be noted that reptiles and amphibians are ectothermic, which means they rely on their climate around them to be happy and healthy. So they would have a need to move in and out of like hot spots in order to regulate the physiological processes, which is absolutely not possible. And these animals will be in this condition for 1 or 2 days, and that excludes the travel time that they are subject to as well. And this expands beyond snakes. This is a way, for example, how lizards, in this instance geckos, are also being kept, and amphibians as well. So these smaller plastic containers on your right contain amphibians and smaller lizards. And as you can see, I've been through these expos, and you can see containers being stacked on top of each other. So even if there would be a heat lamp provided or a UVB lamp provided, these animals at the bottom of the containers would not even have access to that light. What we also see in our visits to exotic pet shows, and what I've witnessed personally, is a lot of stress-related behaviors, or what we would consider stress-related behaviors, including head-hiding behaviors that we see in snakes. For example, ball pythons are very well known for that. And some people might just think it's cute, or it's like it's an innocent behavior, but it's a reaction to a stressful moment that the ball python would curl up in a ball. So the more a python is curled up like that, the more indication it is that the circumstance in which it's living is inadequate. On the right, where you see the lizard tapping on the glass or having its claw on the glass, it's a case of ITB, which is interaction with transparent boundaries, which can cause physical injuries like lesions on their snout and their claws if they keep scratching. In general, reptiles do not understand boundaries. So often they will try to go through the glass, and they'll keep trying. Therefore, one of the recommendations is to not house these animals in transparent glass tanks or plastic tanks. So now we know a little bit about the layout of the exotic pet industry, but we also have to look at the consumer, because as you might remember, we have a three-pronged approach, which includes the purchasing decision-making process. So I referred to this a little bit when I was talking about Kijiji ad. This graph shows you a result from a survey that was conducted by North Star that we commissioned in 2019 because we didn't know how many exotic pets were actually present in Canada. So the result was that it's estimated that about 1.4 million exotic pets are currently in Canada, and mostly birds and reptiles. As you can see, that the light bar reflects the estimated number of animals, and the darker bar reflects the number of households. So you can see that people that own exotic pets not only have one or two, but multiple. And this is not a surprise. As I said prior, exotic pet breeders, they might have 10, 20 or more snakes or other animals in their house because they can breed in relatively poor circumstances. So they can breed while being in a container for their entire lives pretty much. So you can store a lot of animals in the house. Also, when we talk with exotic pet keepers, they often talk about their collection of animals. So it's not surprising if you talk about a collection that you have multiple animals that are a different color, kind, as part of your collection. It's more that you're gathering different animals to improve your collection. So for us, not surprising results, but still very interesting. So what drives people to buy exotic pets? We've noticed that 43% of first-time buyers purchase their animal on an impulse. And this can have great animal welfare implications because if you don't know what you're getting yourself into, and these animals are highly dependent on their climate and environmental conditions in order to thrive and be healthy, it can have a severe impact, negative impact on their health and welfare. Additionally, 17% of people we talked to who are exotic pet owners did not do any research at all. And almost 33% only spend a couple of hours researching what these animals require, which is, again, very problematic. When people look into finding information on how to take care of an exotic animal, they'll go to your local pet stores, friends and family, or they look on websites. And this is important information for us because we would like to meet the people that want to buy an exotic pet for the first time at the point where they are about to make that decision or prior to that. So if we know that they look for information at local pet stores, we can talk with these stores and see if their information that they are providing is accurate and how it can be improved to discourage people from obtaining these animals in the first place. So very recently, we conducted a polling, not us, but we commissioned a polling done by North Star in the summer of 2020 to understand what Canadians think of the exotic pet industry. And this is part of a bigger campaign that we're working on that is trying to move federal and international governments to curb the global wildlife trade. And this is more than just exotic pets, but part of the global wildlife trade would be the exotic pet industry. So what we found in this polling is a great support across Canada for the curbing, improving regulations, or even the ending of the exotic pet trade. So 80% of Canadians, they do not support the capturing, breeding, trading of wild animals for the exotic pet industry. And just to clarify, during that question, exotic wild animals for the exotic pet industry were described as snakes, lizards, and all those smaller species people might not think of when talking about wild animals. 75% of Canadians support a ban on wildlife markets, which is of interest because these reptile expos, they might not look the same, and they are not the same as the wildlife markets we see in Asia or Africa, but it's still a gathering of many wild animals that are being sold freely to the public. So it's interesting that Canadians do have some appetite to have the government take action on that issue. And as you can see, 70% of Canadians also support stronger laws to reduce the trade in wild animals in Canada. So emerging trends. So knowing all this, and especially knowing that regulations throughout all levels of governments is often inadequate, or if not inadequate, hard to enforce. There are some emerging trends that we are witnessing. MLabs, and I should have spelled out the acronym for you before actually using it. So MLabs are mobile live animal programs. And these are businesses that use primarily exotic or rare animals, and they will take them wherever people are willing to pay for them. This can be in schools, birthday parties, elderly homes, mall openings, any event you can think of, you name it, and they can show up there. Again, my amazing volunteers, they discovered that there are over 150 companies that participate in these type of business, in this type of business. So these companies could be zoos that take animals from their permanent location. It can include animal breeders that use the animals that they have to go to schools and etc. And anybody in between. Because to start an MLab, you only need a car, a website, and some animals, and that's pretty much it. There is no regulation about how educated you have to be with the animals, how much experience you have. These kind of criteria don't exist. So that's why we see them sprouting up everywhere. It's concerning because I think many people will go there, A, to get entertained, but B, some might think that there is some educational value, and these businesses will promote themselves as such, regardless if they actually have the papers or the experience, and they will still call themselves educational or conservation minded, and will, with that messaging, try to get people participating in the event or get them to hire them. One of the marketing hooks that's being used is that they allow close proximity with exotic animals, interacting with them and touching them, as we can see here on these photos. So it's an armadillo, and I believe that's a lynx or a bobcat, and it's a caiman up top. So as I said, MLabs are subject to minimal oversight, and to be honest, I think many jurisdictions don't even realize that they're happening. We've talked to many humane societies, OSPCAs, and government at all levels, and when they hear about these events, they're quite surprised that they're happening in their jurisdiction. One of the main issues, besides animal welfare, which is absolutely a great concern, is actually public safety. Because again, many animals, like reptiles and amphibians, inherently carry zoonotic diseases that can be transmitted to people. And as we've seen with COVID and the warning, especially for people that are immunocompromised or fall into the risk category, like kids under the age of 5, the elderly, pregnant women, they have to be extra careful. So there is absolutely a concern for human health in these types of events. Also, because the surfaces these animals touch can, unless they are thoroughly cleaned and disinfected, pathogens can stay on the surface and survive. So even if you're not attending one of these events, if it's, for example, in a school, or I've seen these types of events in cafeterias of like high schools, once the animals are gone, people still can get sick because the pathogen can survive on the surface.
Michele, sorry to interrupt. Can you just repeat for the group what MLabs stands for again? There was a
Absolutely. Question. Mobile Live Animal Programs. Some people might also refer to them as mobile zoos. Moving on, just some pictures I really wanted to share to question how educational these events actually are. On the left, you see an example of how a young sloth is being used in these types of events. And this is the enclosure, if you want to call it an enclosure, where it stays in for 1 to 3 days. And again, this excludes the time that they travel with the animal. Sloths are from the rainforest, they live high up in the trees, and as you can see, there's nothing that reflects the natural conditions of these animals. on the right, and I don't know if you can see it, but behind the plastic step up, it's a reticulated python. And again, there's a complete, they completely ignore the natural environment of these animals. Moving on to another trend we have witnessed. So back in the day, like until the mid-2000s and the 1990s, you might have seen articles of like escapes from tigers, lions, bears, again, those bigger species that are physically dangerous to us. But since more regulation have been introduced to ban these animals, we don't see them as often in the news anymore. But instead, we have seen an uptake in stray snakes that are being found. And I'm not quite sure why it's just snakes and why not lizards or other exotic pets for that matter. And something that would be interesting to look into, especially during the summer. And I think when the news is kind of slowing down, media has time for other types of messages and reporting on things that are happening. So in 2019, with the easy Google search, we found about 8 articles talking about escapes or strays that are being found. However, in 2020, there was an uptake, and we found at least 12 articles, and most of the strays that were found was during the summertime. Sometimes it was, people might dispose the animal. Sometimes they escaped and somebody reported it. It's not surprising that this is happening throughout the country. I mean, with the number of animals that are being imported, the number of animals that are being bred, like these animals have to be somewhere, right? And they might escape. There might be high mortality rates, but that's still a big question mark in all the research that we've conducted so far. So what we do know is that the increase of the snakes that are being found is in line with what shelters are experiencing. So we, in collaboration with Humane Canada, we looked at the intake of exotic animals in shelters. I believe that study was also conducted in 2019. And a third of the exotic animals that have been delivered to shelters are owner surrendered or strays. And unfortunately, 1 in 5 are euthanized. And from my own experience, I can tell you that shelters are struggling, especially when it comes to outplacement of these animals. I got an email recently from a humane society in Manitoba asking me, are there any bona fide sanctuaries where I can move a snake to? And in Canada, honestly, there are none. There are no good solutions. There's no real plan B for these animals. So it's very hard even for humane societies and people that are in support of a messaging that these animals should not be kept in captivity to keep them out of the exotic pet trade. Another need that was identified by shelters is the need for education. When it comes to MLabs or the purchasing of exotic pets, the public needs to be educated better why these animals are not appropriate to be kept in our households. So animal welfare and other risks. So this part I will go through quite quickly because Rob Laidlaw, who will be speaking after me, can probably talk about this for hours, about the animal welfare risks that are inherent to the exotic pet trade. I do want to mention some other risks, and it's almost the classic 3. So we have animal welfare, public safety, and our environment that we need to be concerned about when we talk about the exotic pet trade. First of all, animal welfare. Exotic wild animals, as it says, they're wild animals. They haven't co-evolved with us, and they're not meant to be in captivity. Especially if we look at animals that live in tanks, their captivity is so heavily restricted, even more than dogs and cats. Dogs and cats might roam through the house, and they can thrive well in the environment that we live in. But because reptiles and amphibians and other animals are so highly reliant on climate, on certain diet, it's just very difficult to keep them in captivity. And even zoos are struggling with this. So we understand people love their animals and they want to take care for them in the best way possible. But in the end of the day, exotic animals just do not make good pets. Often this can result in stress-related captivity stress-related behaviors. On the right, you see a African gray parrot that plucked out all his or her feathers. And on the left, you see physical damage that captivity can cause, which is a ball python that got burned, probably on a heat lamp that was not far enough from the animal. And why these animals get burned is because, you know, sometimes the climate within a tank is not sufficient enough and they're trying to warm up their bodies faster or longer than they would in nature, and therefore they might end up being burned. What we struggle with, one of the things in our messaging, is I think that people base their husbandry principles when it comes to exotic animals on evidence that has been gathered within the captive bred industry. But just because an animal lives longer or because an animal is able to reproduce doesn't mean it has good welfare, right? So if looking at this picture, on the left you see a tank, as many others, that is apparently appropriate for a turtle. But if we look at the actual habitat, natural habitat where the animals come from, it's far bigger, more complex, more interesting for the animal that we could ever provide in a small tank. If it comes to temperature gradients, you know, the water quality, the sourcing of food, hunting, etc. These are all things that cannot be replicated in a captive environment, and especially not an environment that is a standard tank that we find in our pet stores. And this applies to reptiles, it applies to amphibians, it applies to sugar gliders who are being kept, they're nocturnal animals and people will have them as pets. Completely unsuitable. So we have to work towards the realization that these tanks and the environment we're offering them in this very small, barren enclosures or tanks that we're providing, that's a far cry away from the actual environment these animals are from. And while they might survive, and while they might eat, and while they might breed, it doesn't mean that they're actually happy and healthy, which is something I would think any pet owner would want their animal to be. Public health, as I mentioned before, something that we also keep talking about is, I mean, there are other diseases as well. Reptiles can carry strains as, for example, West Nile virus. But salmonella would be the main one if we look at reptiles and amphibians. And it's not just us who is saying this. We know that public health agencies in Canada, in the US, across the world are saying similar things. If we look at guidelines for example, schools in Ontario, they will say reptiles are not pets, not good school pets. They should not be in a classroom. If you look at guidelines for elderly home, it says reptiles and amphibians and parrots and birds should not be allowed in these homes because they inherently carry diseases, which especially certain groups in the population are very sensitive to and can get very sick from. Examples are plenty, and I think, well, in the States, the tracking of outbreaks might be a little bit better than here in Canada. We did have in Canada an outbreak in December of last year that was linked to pet snakes and rodent feeders. So the rodents that are fed to the snakes that need to be thawed because they're frozen, and in that process, bacteria can start to grow, etc. So that was an outbreak. The notice included that it was over 90 cases that had been reported across 6 provinces. And if you have a child, for example, and you call the health line, I don't know if it's specific to Toronto or Ontario, they might actually ask you if your child has been in touch with a reptile. So it is quite a common knowledge and practice that these animals transmit the diseases, but somehow in the communication with customers or like first-time buyers or at reptile expos or these mobile live animal programs, they fail to communicate this. And they underplay the risk that is related to the outbreak. Just recently in the US, I think it was last week, there was a report of a salmonella outbreak linked to hedgehog and bearded dragons, which is a type of lizard. Habitat and ecosystems. I also talked a little bit about this. Canada is home to a couple of invasive species, mostly in British Columbia, I would say, probably because of the climate. So red ear sliders, the American bullfrog that has been introduced in British Columbia, as well as the Italian wall lizard. With climate change and perhaps milder winters, there is a higher risk of animals that have escaped or be released will be able to become invasive, and they'll start competing with resources against local wildlife. Another risk, however, that can be underplayed, and this also links back to the start of my presentation when talking about what happens at the border, is that some animals can be carrier of diseases. And while the animal itself doesn't need to escape or be released, these diseases can be transferred because of water that they live in and that's being flushed through the drain and therefore comes into our environment. This is something we have seen with this chytrid fungus that had decimated amphibian populations across the world. And it's one of the reasons why salamanders now in Canada are not allowed to be imported for the purpose of pets. Zoos might be able to get a special permission or research, but salamanders can now be imported as pets. Why this only applies to salamanders, again, is unknown, because this virus there is one strain that affects only salamanders, but there's another strain that affects other frogs. And it seems to be that it's purely reactionary. So once an animal is invasive, once an animal has introduced a novel disease, then we act. And we have to flip the system around to protect, our public health, to protect our environment, but also to protect animals that are caught up in this industry. So quick last couple of slides. Learnings, what did we learn from our research? There is very little publicly available data. So much of the data we had to gather through access to information requests, through my volunteers who who searched the internet for the number of breeders, the number of websites where you can buy these animals, etc. And that's a real issue, because without sufficient data, it's hard to show that there is a problem. I think we've shown that there are great volumes of animals coming in the country, going out of the country, are being bred within the country and being sold. And again, the question is, with all these animals, and I believe only about 5% being an exotic animal owner, what happens to all of them? Are there high mortality rates? Are they kept somewhere? Are they being released? Like, the math doesn't add up. So by collecting more data, we're finding other pieces of the puzzle. Myth busting is key. As I said, and Rob will talk after me about this, is that there's a plethora of information on the internet, and much of it is maybe not true, maybe half true, and not necessarily based on the natural habitat and behaviors that animals would show in the wild, but are merely based on trial and error husbandry practices that have established itself over a period of time and are therefore now acceptable. However, and going back to my point earlier, just because an animal is able to live longer or breed, it doesn't mean it has good welfare. We also realize that a three-pronged approach is the best way to tackle this issue, because everybody has a role to play, whether it's importing the animals, breeding them, selling them, or buying them. At any point in the trade chain, we will be able to educate people and bring up evidence that something needs to change. So the road ahead, it's long, but I'm very excited about this work, and I think there's a lot of traction. I mean, this presentation alone, 186 people are on this call, which is incredible. So I think it just shows that we keep working on this issue together by reducing demand and reducing acceptability. One thing that we're really fighting for is more transparency in the exotic pet supply chain. And I think active advocates for other, if it's farming or when it comes to the sales of puppies, this is always a big one, is that wherever the animals are bred, it's not accessible to the public. There are no glass windows where you can look through and make sure that, things are done humanely, are done according to the standards that do exist. And many of the breeders are just not, they don't have a storefront and they might just be in their homes. So it's very hard to keep track of them and to hold them accountable for things that they're doing. So we'll keep fighting for that. And then we continue advocacy for the positive list, which is a solution other than banning the full trade that I think is palatable for governments. And I would highly recommend, if you're interested in that, in 2 weeks from now, I'll be speaking more on that topic, and I'll explain more about why positive list regulations that will list the animals you're allowed to keep are more efficient and more enforceable than the negative regulations that we see in most jurisdictions currently. So the list of animals are prohibited to protect. How can you help as an advocate, as somebody who works with exotic animals, comes across them? Something that could really support our work and perhaps your own work is speaking out for exotic animals. And this includes publishing public statements on your website and clearly state exotic animals are unsuitable as pets. Humane Canada, the Canadian Veterinarian Medical Association, they all have these statements on the website. And if we talk to businesses, to people in the government, and we can refer to, an SPCA who has great standing in communities usually, it really helps our cause. Also, whenever you hear about people who wanted to book an MLab, want to visit an exotic reptile expo or another pet expo that has exotic animals, explain why this is not a good idea and why the whole trade is really an issue from the moment they're bred or they're wild caught to the moment they end up in our houses. Helping us collecting data, always welcome, because as I said, that's one of the main challenges. And then when it comes to advocacy, wherever there are opportunities to talk about this subject, either on municipal level, provincial level, or federal government, we're always happy to explain to people why this issue should be addressed. And I think in the time we live in now is that the public health will play a major role in future decisions being made about animals. Because we've seen that interacting with wildlife brings some risks with it. And I believe that's it. So thank you very much for attending my talk, and I'm very much looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thanks, Michele. And we certainly do have a couple of questions lined up. One of the people who were asking questions has had to leave, unfortunately, but I think she's asked a couple of interesting questions that other people will be interested in. So the first one is, and this was from Stephanie Evers, do you think zoos, specifically roadside zoos, play a large part in the trade?
Yes, I think when it comes to larger species like lions, lemurs, tigers, I think roadside zoos still play a significant part. I haven't seen a lot of roadside zoos that are specifically focused on reptiles or amphibians because I think it's less attractive to people to actually visit them. But we do see roadside zoos still pop up in Ontario that have cub petting and that somehow get their hands on these young animals and just reinforce that cycle of needing young animals in order to attract people and therefore keep contributing to the trade.
Great. So the next question comes from Laura. What campaign tools, techniques have you identified as most effective to reduce the demand for exotic pets?
That's a very good question. One of the tools I really like because, especially in time of COVID, we can't really go out and talk to people. We have developed a disruption page which contains information on, for example, parrots. And that page, when people will be looking, for example, I want to buy a parrot, the page will pop up and they will click on it and they read it. And after they read the first section, will be, did we change our mind? Yes, no. Answer is no, keep reading. And in the end, we can ask them, like, did we change your mind? Yes, no. And this is a way how we can track if we actually change behaviors. That would probably be one of the more interesting tools, I think, that we've used during this campaign.
Great, thank you. Next question up is from Olivia Herbert. Research conducted where respected reptile keepers are contacted and their animal husbandry is reviewed/approved of.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yep. Has there been research conducted where respected reptile keepers are contacted and their animal husbandry is reviewed and approved of?
I see. So I think we have reached out to breeders in general, and I think they're not very willing. If we say we're from an animal welfare organization, in general, they're not willing to share any information. But if you look, I mean, reading books and literature, etc., really helps to give you a good idea about what the information says about the keeping of reptiles. I would love to go into conversation with reptile breeders on this topic. I remember 2 years ago when I spoke in Montreal on this topic, there was a back and forth, and I invited the gentleman to stay on and to talk because I want to learn more and I would love to work together on this issue. But so far, it's very hard to find people that are willing to have a very calm and productive conversation about this. Most reactions that we're getting on our Facebook, on our social media platform, are honestly quite aggressive, which doesn't help the conversation. But if it's up to me, I would love to talk more with people that actually own these animals.
Great, thank you. All right, next question is from Tracy Tom. There are standards of care available for most livestock and for domestic animals. Could someone not write standards of care for exotics? Each would need a specific standard of care. Without this, there are only guidelines available online which are not enforceable. With standards of care, enforcement officers would have something to refer to, enforce, etc. Are they in the works? Do we know if there are any in the works?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is really difficult. And the main reason is because, for example, if we talk about dogs, we talk about a certain species with certain breeds. But if we talk about reptiles, there are 11,000 species of reptiles now. And each reptile lives in this microhabitat that needs specific dietary requirements, like climate requirements, whatever. So it's really difficult to specify all the specific needs for each single reptile, amphibian, or other exotic animal that is within the trait, just for the mere number of species. Furthermore, I think, as you saw in my picture, to try to summarize all the habitat influences they would experience in the wild and try to replicate it in a tank or a small area, I think that's just unrealistic.
Thank you. We have lots of questions, so I'm not sure how much time we have left, so let's keep banging through here. From Dr. Christina Nellist, we found in the UK that many breeders were in fact involved in the importation of illegally traded animals. Do we have any data on this in Canada?
Not that there is some organizations like Traffic that used to have an office here in Canada that had looked into it, and I am aware there's another organization currently looking into the illegal trade, but there is no information available as far as I know. And I think it's mainly caused because, especially when it comes to reptile and amphibians, there's just very little control at the border. So it would be hard to track. And for CVSA officers to be able to identify certain reptile species, that's an unbegotten task.
Great. Okay, we have a question here around the MLAPs that you mentioned. You suggest that people do not book them, but some of these places are providing online presentations. How do we counter that since human safety factor is removed?
Yeah, I think from an animal welfare perspective, you can still make the case that these sessions are not necessarily educational. I think perpetuating the idea that animals are a possession, you can touch them. Like, you know, they might have a message like, oh, you pick up I have a snake in my hand. Some things sometimes, or like the MLabs I visited, I've seen it multiple times, that they will pick up a turtle and they say like, but don't do this yourself in the wild, like always leave the animals be. So I think the education message is still, it doesn't connect. I think there are still animal welfare grounds as to recommend people not to watch these events online. But anything that is online, it's harder to track and battle. But I think the first step is to have a look at these places once they're out in public again. And some places have continued, right, with smaller groups, and you pay them, and you can come to their place or facility to do these tours. So starting with that would be, I think, an excellent start.
Great. So I think probably one more question, Jade, or two, but there's a really great one here around, do we think the COVID-19 pandemic has created any shift in the thought process for federal and provincial governments to bring any concrete change in the laws or to pass a new one?
That is a great question. I think so. I think currently still the governments or people we spoke to, they're still very much trying to deal with the situation. And of course, there's like, you know, unemployment and other things that are considered to be a priority at that point in time. But I think when the government said about they want to look into prevention, and that's where this would play a role. And I'm hoping that as far as the conversations that we had with people that work in the government, they acknowledge there is a gap. So at least we're on the right messaging, and I think people being aware now of zoonotic diseases, and you know, we have evidence that animals are shipped across the world. They come in from countries where biosecurity might not be considered at all. That steps will be taken, but it's especially like federal government, things move slow sometimes, so it might not be something that happens tomorrow, but I think they're definitely talking about how to prevent this from happening, and the wildlife trade plays a role in that for the prevention.
Great. Okay, I think we probably should move on to our next speaker, but there are lots of questions there, Michele. I'm not sure if you open up the Q&A on your own screen.
I can answer them.
Yeah, you can just type answer. You can use the
Sure.
type of answer live and get some of these questions answered. I think that'd be great.
I will do that.
Okay, awesome. All right. So thank you again for that really informative presentation. And there are lots and lots of great questions. So thanks for submitting those, and Michele will keep answering them for you. So our next speaker today is Rob Laidlaw. Rob is the executive director of wildlife protection charity Zoocheck, which is our partner in this webinar series. He's also a chartered biologist and a former Humane Society inspector and a past project manager for wildlife protection. His work has involved a wide variety of investigations, legislative campaigns, legal actions, capacity building programs, and animal rescues here in Canada and around the world. Rob is also an award-winning author of 10 children's books about animal welfare and wildlife protection, which are so important, as well as numerous other publications. And in 2014, he was awarded the prestigious Frederick McGrand Lifetime Achievement Award for substantial contributions to animal welfare in Canada, which was extremely well deserved. So, Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you, Cass. There is one little facet of my background that was not included in that little biographical sketch that you provided. And I thought, in the interest of full disclosure, I would mention that as a kid, I was actually one of what I would term my opposition these days, at least in the political side of things. I used to keep exotic pets, and I had many kinds of exotic pets, primarily reptiles, but one of the areas that I was particularly interested in were fish. So I had quite a wide variety of saltwater fish and freshwater fish. I belonged to fish clubs, went to fish shows. I belonged to a herpetology club. And I found the practice of keeping these animals, because they're amazing, fascinating animals, to be very rewarding for myself. But when I was about 12 years old, I had an epiphany. I remember sitting in my bedroom and I had about 20 aquariums full of these unfortunately incarcerated creatures. And I looked at the fish and I said to myself, that's not much of a life for those fish. And, you know, I was very young, but I realized that the relationship that I had with the fish and with the other animals that I had kept was one-sided. I got something that enriched my life, that I found interesting and enjoyable. I had activities associated with the keeping of those animals. But when I compared that to what the animals actually got, there wasn't much. It was a one-sided relationship and there was nothing reciprocal about it. You know, when I've had cats and dogs, I can establish a beneficial, very reciprocal relationship where all the signs are that they're benefiting as much or enjoying as much the relationship as I am, but that was not the case for exotic animals. And I think a lot of exotic animal keepers really need to look at what kind of relationship that they have. And if they do, and they honestly assess it, I think that they'll find that it is a one-sided relationship. They get something out of it. The animals don't get very much at all. Now, I'm very pleased to be able to talk about animal welfare. I think it's a very important topic. And one of the reasons I think it's important, because in doing advocacy work regarding wildlife in captivity for the last 30 or 40 years, I found a lot of people have different ideas about animal welfare, what animal welfare is. Some people can explain it. Many people cannot. Even advocates for animals cannot explain it, or they can only articulate it in a way that isn't really accurate. So I'm hoping that my presentation today will give some people some clarity, some ideas. It is a massive, massive topic. So I'm only going to touch on a number of things. But if you go to an animal welfare conference, particularly a technical or scientific conference, you will find many experts speaking for many days about animal welfare, including what it is. But hopefully, you know, my presentation will provide some clarity and help people who are advocating for exotic animals. Now, here in Canada, when I started all those years ago, the predominant issues that were discussed when you were discussing exotic pets were the large, charismatic, often dangerous animals. So in my home province of Ontario, I remember going out in the late 70s and early 80s, and there were many, many people, probably in the many hundreds, that were keeping all of these animals that typically most people would find in a zoo setting. So I could drive out of my home city of Toronto and visit somebody who had a tiger, and then somebody else down the road who had a leopard, and then somebody who had a troop of monkeys, a bear, a wolf, and they dotted the province in quite prodigious numbers. Well, those days, certainly here in Canada, are largely over. Many of these animals still exist, but the numbers of them are greatly suppressed compared to what they were when I started. And a lot of that has come from education, from people, especially people in their own communities, not enjoying the fact that their neighbors or somebody down the street has these animals, and they may be concerned for their own safety, but many people articulated concerns about welfare and about other issues that affected the animals as well as themselves. But we've seen a gradual diminishment of these sort of large, dangerous, and often obvious animals. They're hard to hide. Right across the country, there seems to have been quite a substantive decline. But what we've seen taking their place is, as these larger, more charismatic animals, or I shouldn't insult the smaller animals, they're charismatic too. As these larger, more dangerous animals started to decrease in numbers, that sort of exotic pet or exotic animal keeping gap has been filled by others. So you've got a variety of smaller exotic mammals, including animals as large as wallabies and kangaroos and capybaras, but also a lot of other smaller mammals. You've got African pouched rats, sugar gliders, and other kinds of mammals like that. We've seen certainly a prodigious number of birds out there, and I think birds, when you look at numbers in North America, they're the fourth most popular kind of pet. There's very large numbers of birds. Many of them are the smaller finches, canaries, and budgerigars, but we also have a whole wide variety of other kinds of birds, and particularly parrots. They're one of the more higher profile kinds of birds. And of course, as Michele Hamers mentioned, we have loads and loads of reptiles. There are very large numbers of reptiles, large numbers of amphibians, and certainly large numbers of fish and invertebrates as well. One of the things I do want to mention is that another change that's occurred from the days of everybody having a lion and tiger in their backyard to today is that 20 or 30 years ago, when we walked into the office of an animal control person or a policymaker, all of these issues related to exotic animals were seen as sort of peripheral or fringe issues. That's not the case today. Now, we don't often or always see, the political follow-up that we would like to see after we meet with policymakers or other officials. But today, these issues are taken very seriously, and there's a lot of interest in them. And we've been quite surprised at the receptiveness to knowing more about these animals, to wanting to mitigate the problems associated with them. So for me, personally, I think that's a bit of a sea change. It's a completely different political landscape for the issue than existed 20 years ago. And I think that's very promising. And our work over the last few years has encouraged me even more, because the levels of receptiveness to trying to do something to help these animals has grown exponentially. Now, there's a number of key issues, and I've got some fairly text-heavy slides, and I'm not just going to read off the slides. I'm going to highlight certain points, and I believe these presentations will be available later for anybody who wants the actual text on all of the slides. But I wanted to talk about just a few of the key issues. Some of them Michele Hamers had covered, one of them being the very large number of animal species currently in or available for trade, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Certainly animal welfare, not only the holding and care that these animals are provided with in the consumer retail setting or in the home setting, but also if they're captured from the wild, transported, held in brokerage facilities or other types of places like that. And a lot of people who keep exotic pets don't realize that many of the animals that they could potentially purchase in their own communities may have been wild caught. And the numbers that are wild caught, extracted from intact wild habitats, number in the millions each year. So animal welfare is certainly a key concern. And of course, there's other trade issues, there's disease issues and invasiveness issues. Here in Canada, we have generally a colder climate, and Ms. Hamers had mentioned that we do have some invasive reptiles, but we've seen a whole influx of new species coming up. Here in Toronto, we now have turkey vultures and opossums, and there's a whole range of other species that have moved north because of the warming through climate change. And that creates a potential for other animals, perhaps ones that are considered more exotic, to actually come here and survive. Nobody thought red-eared sliders could survive and breed in this kind of climate that we have here in Ontario and the rest of Canada. But now red-eared sliders have surprised everybody, and they're populating the Great Lakes Basin and many other parts of Canada and other places around the world. So there can be some very interesting surprises on the way because of the change in climate. And of course, there's human health and safety issues. There's nuisance issues on a local level. And there's cost issues for enforcement agencies and governments that try to deal with these problems. But key for us, our clients are the animals. The key core concern for us is the welfare of these unfortunate creatures that are caught up in the exotic pet trade. Now, I mentioned numbers. There's a diversity of species in the exotic pet trade. Estimates place the numbers that are currently in trade at more than 1,000. And of course, there's more available. And many of these animals that are potentially available for exploitation through the pet industry have never really been studied in the wild. So then, natural life histories, their nutritional needs, all of these facets that are really required in order to provide good husbandry based on evidence and fact and knowledge don't exist. Now, looking at numbers, I've put here, I looked these up yesterday, the numbers of species, and you can see that, today there's in reptiles alone, as of yesterday, 11,341, there's an extra one in there, species of reptiles, with about 700 that are commonly found in trade right now. So there's a lot of room for additional animals to be exploited. And what's really interesting when you look at the pet trade is that when new species are discovered, like earless monitors in Asia, there's often a rush by the pet trade and certain pet people within the pet trade. I'm not trying to tar everyone or demonize everyone in the trade, but there's often a rush to try to get those animals from the wild, even if they're endangered, and exploit them, because that's when you can make the most profit. But you can see here when you're looking at the numbers of species that there's a lot of room for growth and for adding additional species. And certainly we've seen pet industry people say that they want the opportunity to exploit other species. And that's one of the reasons that some of them have said they don't like regulation. So obstacles to good exotic animal welfare, there are certainly quite a number of them. Problematic laws and regulations, which as this series continues, we'll get into more, are a very important obstacle and one that as advocates, we all at one point or another will probably end up dealing with. And one of the facets of those laws and regulations is that many species are overlooked or ignored. And certainly here in Canada, when you look at municipal initiatives, usually in the form of bylaws, when you look at what they prohibit under their traditional prohibited or negative list, you find that they're mammal-centric, that they focus a lot on mammals that have a perceived risk to humans in terms of their physical safety, but that you have very few birds, very few reptiles, very few amphibians, very few fish ever included on these lists. They're completely overlooked, even though they have many types of problems associated with them, not the least of which is welfare. The other one out of this list that's on the screen now that I want to highlight are these entrenched beliefs, assumptions, and what are called folklore husbandry practices. And that's a term that I wasn't familiar with until my colleague Clifford Warwick out of the UK brought it to my attention and others here in Canada previously, and I think it's worth talking about, so I will talk about it a little bit more in a minute. But we have a lot of entrenched beliefs and assumptions about animals. One of them that I'll highlight is that the pet industry will often portray many animals as easy to keep. And I don't think there is such a thing as an easy to keep animal. Many of these supposedly easy to keep animals are often marketed as starter pets. Well, I don't think there is such a thing as a starter pet. It doesn't matter what animal you have, whether it's invertebrate or a large mammal. You have homework to do, and it will be a challenge to provide that animal with all of the conditions that it needs to survive in a healthy way with a high degree of welfare. And you can see here there's some other additional problems. And one of them that Michele Hamers had mentioned was a lack of placement opportunities for abandoned, seized, and unwanted exotic pets. That's something that is an issue that comes up time and time again in discussions, certainly regulatory discussions when exotic pets are the discussion point. So I did mention folklore husbandry, and I think it's ubiquitous in the exotic pet trade. Now, certainly there are people in the pet trade that do have a high level of expertise, but I think we can't look at them and assume that that 1% of people in the pet trade that have that technical and scientific knowledge and background, that they represent everybody else, because they don't. If you looked at the poll that Michele Hamers talked about, the percentages of people that are buying that do no research, have no knowledge, those kinds of things, you find that that's most of the pet trade. So, we'll put aside those people and focus on the other 98 or 99%. Now, a lot of them practice folklore husbandry. And what folklore husbandry is, and I took a definition off of the web yesterday, it's folklore husbandry describes captive management practices that are lacking in scientific validation or support, or that are contrary to current knowledge and understanding of a species biology, or are continued due to tradition and history. And some of them that sort of jumped out at me, and this was a list I just created off the top of my head, is that a lot of exotic pet keepers, particularly for the so-called lower animals, the reptiles, the amphibians, the fish and invertebrates, they consider them like biological robots where they don't really have thought processes about how they conduct their lives. They're not making decisions. They're not engaged mentally that way, that they're largely hardwired and driven by instinct. And I think if you look at the incredibly robust body of scientific knowledge that currently exists, and at all of the new papers that are coming out every year, peer-reviewed journal papers about the cognitive, emotional, and social abilities of all these so-called lower animals, you find that, hey, they are not biological robots. They are far more complex, far more like mammals and birds than most of us ever thought. This idea that some of these animals, and I'll target many of the reptile keepers who keep many of their animals in rack systems or in drawers or Tupperware containers, they really see them in a way as biological robots. So I think that's something that was a belief that's carried forward, that these animals, they just need a small space, some food and water and some heat, and they're fine. That's outdated, that's old, that is not validated by science. I mentioned earlier, easy to keep. There's no such thing as a starter pet, but a lot of people believe that these animals that they perceive, usually erroneously, to have simple needs are good for kids or for other people who are just getting their feet wet with exotic animals. Well, that's just not true. One more or two more that I'll mention, and then I'll move on, is this idea that exotic pets are domesticated. Well, I would challenge that assertion. Certainly, many exotic animals have been bred. You look at crested geckos, you look at ball pythons, you look at canaries, you look at a number of different species, and you see that certainly there's been, through breeding in captivity, and through other things that have occurred, changes in these animals. But for the majority of them, I think domestication is really a stretch. If you look at the tests for domestication, you would find that most of these animals don't satisfy the requirements that are generally considered when you're looking at whether something is domesticated or not. And I'll just mention a couple of them. They're available on the internet, as is everything else, of course. But under Diamond's tests for domestication, just there's six particular items that are required. One of them is an amenable disposition. Well, a lot of exotic pets, you look at monkeys, you look at many of the reptiles, you look at a whole wide variety of other creatures. That isn't something that's satisfied. Generally, domesticated animals have, in their natural lives, a follow the leader kind of hierarchy. And that's why you see cattle, sheep, and a number of other species that have been domesticated successfully, and others, even ones that are like them, so other ungulate species that don't have that hierarchy, that are not domesticated. And certainly for exotics, you don't see that follow the leader hierarchy in the majority of them. And there's the third one I'll mention on the list is relative calmness when kept in captivity or faced with a predator. And certainly when you look at a whole swath of exotic creatures, you find that they have real challenges when they're in captivity. Just a couple more from this page is one, and this one absolutely fascinates me because I don't understand why people believe this, but that flying animals, particularly birds, don't need opportunities to fly. And I find it incredulous that so many people who keep parrots think that deflighting parrots is fine, but I've seen them in Asia. I've seen them in Latin America flying, these highly gregarious, super intelligent birds where flight is a key facet of their lives. And I find it incredulous that people would think it would be acceptable to deflight these birds using whatever mechanism that they choose to make that happen and think that's okay. That's folklore husbandry. And I think we really have to do everything we can. A lot of folklore husbandry does not stand up when it's scrutinized. And a lot of what's going on out there in terms of husbandry is convenience-based, because if you said this is what the animal actually needs, then there'd be no market for these animals because nobody could afford to do that. And you have a good analogous situation with zoos. If you look at their accreditation standards, they gravitate towards the lowest common denominator amongst their member institutions. Because if a zoo association said, well, you guys are keeping elephants, and we know that elephants need 650 acres, well, if that were the standard that was promulgated by the Zoo Association, none of their member facilities that keep elephants would be able to continue being a member. They would drop out because they couldn't satisfy that standard. So you see a lot of this gravitating towards the lowest common denominator because of people that purchase these animals and because of convenience. Now, what is animal welfare? Well, animal welfare science is evolving, and there used to be a bit of debate on what exactly animal welfare is. I think it's changed. If we look at one of these earlier definitions by Donald Broom, I believe this was in 1985, and Donald Broom was scientific person from the UK, and the UK actually was the originating point for a lot of very novel ideas about animal welfare. But the definition that Donald Broom came up with was the welfare of an individual animal is their state as they attempt to cope with their environment. And I think that still holds through today, but we have developed from that original starting point. There's been a lot of new ideas, new definitions, and different methods formulated to assess animal welfare, and they continue to come out. Every few months, I'll read a journal paper or something else that talks about, hey, there's a different way of doing things and assessing animal welfare. But I think that starting point of Donald Broom still holds. Now, one of the things that has now widely accepted is that good welfare is not the same as simply maintaining an animal's physical functioning to keep it alive and reproducing. And a lot of people in the past just assumed that that was the case. And that was actually manifested in a lot of legislation. You would see, if the animal was just physically functioning, if it could move, if it was breathing, eating, pooping, or reproducing, then it was fine. But that's not what animal welfare is. This is an outdated way of looking at animal welfare. And today you also find that it's not just removing negative factors in an animal's life. So it could be negative emotional states that lead to suffering. But welfare today is very intricately connected to an animal experiencing positive things in its life. It's not enough just to not have all these negative things, because you could use an analogous situation for humans in a prison. They may not have so many of these negative things occurring, but they may not have very much on the other side of the coin, which are the positive things. So it's not just removing negative things. Animals have to have positive states, experiences, activities in their lives. Now, I looked up just a few quotes, and I think this is getting pretty much ubiquitous in the scientific literature about animal welfare. You know, it just echoes that point that, you know, the old idea that, you know, just the basic functioning of the animal isn't what animal welfare is. And you can see here a quote by Jake Vesey, an animal welfare scientist, very progressive and productive person in the field, saying that good welfare is when an animal feels happy or content. And I think most people believe that. Now, the other thing that's emerged, and it's not really a new idea, you know, it originated after World War II when zoo biology sort of came into its own. This idea that if you're going to address animal keeping and animal welfare, then you really have to look and use as a benchmark how that animal actually lives in nature. And that's something that has been slow to take hold. It's manifested quite well in the academic literature, whether it's the zoo field or other wildlife captivity fields. But in practice, it's been slow to take hold. We do see some examples of it. In the exotic pet trade, I think it's largely ignored, and we'll see why in a couple of minutes. Now, one of the best ways of describing animal welfare, and I don't know if he came up with this, but certainly it's been articulated in numerous papers and other published materials by David Fraser from the University of BC, is this idea that there are three components to animal welfare. The first component is this biological functioning, which I've already talked about. So, you know, the respiration, circulation, digestion, blood hormone levels, all those things. Are they within the parameters of normality for the particular species? And I think that's sometimes hard to tell because, you know, so many animals in captivity are so distorted physically that it's hard to decide what is normal. But, you know, by using the animal in the wild as the benchmark, we can get some idea. But that's only one component of animal welfare. The second component I've mentioned, the psychological functioning, or how an animal feels, so its affective states. Is it feeling good, as Jake Vesey said? That's a very important second component. And then the third component, which is something that is not manifested in most wildlife captivity situations today, is this component that comprises the natural living of the animal. So can that animal live a life according to the adaptations that it's evolved with? And if it can't, then you've got an animal that's in this completely artificial context that can't really do anything that it's supposed to do and that it's evolved to do. And if you look at the exotic pet trade, you find a disproportionate emphasis, almost ubiquitous emphasis on number one, the biological functioning of the animal. And you cannot achieve good welfare by focusing only on that. So animal welfare principles and frameworks have been developed. One of them was a set of ideas that became the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. That was in 1965. The Bramble Commission, reporting to the Farm Animal Welfare Council, developed the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. And they've been used all over the world, and they're articulated in numerous policies, regulations, and laws in a variety of different contexts. I think they're a very good framework. Some people have suggested adding additional freedoms. There has been some criticism of them, but I think that they're a good starting point often for this animal welfare discussion. Now, the 5 freedoms of animal welfare are articulated here on this slide: freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom to express normal behavior, and freedom from fear and distress. And I'll just give you a sort of a couple of ideas about each point. And I think many of you may already be familiar with these, so I'll go through them fairly quickly. So freedom from hunger and thirst, I think, is somewhat self-evident. So providing food and water that's nutritive in sufficient quantity, feeding that particular food and presenting that that water in a species appropriate way, and that's often not done. Keeping and preparing food in hygienic conditions, considering natural behavior, which relates to what I just said. So you've got a number of facets of this idea that there should be freedom from hunger and thirst, and that impact on interpretation of that particular freedom. The second one, freedom from discomfort. Again, I think it's largely self-evident. Providing suitable environmental conditions, suitable terrain, suitable shade and shelter, privacy, all of those things that prevent discomfort. I think most of you could probably guess at additional factors that would be considered when you're looking at freedom from discomfort. You've got freedom from pain, injury, and disease, again, related to the health of the animals. And I would actually add in to this particular suite of items that we want to also look at if the animal is healthy when compared to how its conspecifics in the wild would live, because what we have today in many circumstances is one captive setting being compared to another captive setting. And I think that, again, we have to follow all of the people who have expressed and promoted this idea that originated largely in the modern era in zoo biology, that we have to look back at the wild animal. And I'll just give everyone an example. If you look at big cats in captivity, I've seen big cats in the wild and I've seen them in captivity. And there's an epidemic of obesity in big cats in captivity. So it's, I think, a good exercise in understanding where that animal should be by not just looking at other situations in captivity that also are part of this epidemic of obesity, but looking at how healthy animals in the wild are doing physically. Freedom to express normal behavior. And you can outfit environments, captive environments, to make sure that happens. And if you look at so many of the exotic pets, they just don't have those things that allow them to express normal behaviors. And freedom from fear and distress. That can be, lizards that see being viewed by people as a threat and to hold still. It can be animals trying to run, animals that want to become aggressive and fight because they feel threatened, those types of things. So there's all kinds of things, and I'm sure many of you can think of many more that would factor in when you're looking at freedom from fear and distress. So the 5 freedoms of animal welfare were pretty good. They were very, very progressive when they came out in 1965. And I put in this slide, and I can't remember what kind of crocodilian this is, but you can see that in this case, most of the 5 freedoms wouldn't be satisfied. It's basically a concrete trough that this animal's forced to live in. And I've watched alligators and crocodiles in the wild, and sure, they may sun themselves on riverbanks and have periods where they're not engaged in a lot of activity or a lot of movement, but they do things, and they have substantial home ranges. They will interact. There is an element of sociality in their lives. So, when you look at animals and you compare the 5 freedoms to what they have, I think you'll find that many of them, especially in the exotic pet trade, often come up short. So what do we know about animal welfare, especially for exotics, is that the 3 interrelated components of animal welfare are critical. If you're missing any one of them, you will have poorer welfare. Welfare exists on a continuum of poor to excellent. So you can have poor or almost non-existent welfare, or you can have excellent welfare. Wherever anyone is on that sort of sliding rule or that continuum, you always want to push towards excellent, even if it's just in small incremental steps. We know that welfare decreases when an animal has to cope with its environment. If it's spending all its time coping, it's reducing the number of positive experiences. It may reduce that animal's physical health. It will impact in a negative way. The animal shouldn't be trying to always cope just to survive. We have to realize that, as I mentioned earlier, that science is now telling us that the cognitive, emotional, and social abilities of many of these so-called lower animals, they're not lower animals. They are different, but that many of them will have many of the same physical and mental attributes, may be different in degree that many birds and mammals do. So we know generally where we should be going with welfare when it comes to exotic pets, but we have a lot of challenges faced by these animals. Some of them are self-evident. Both Michele and I have talked about them. I always think, and I'm a big fan of restating several times some of these points, because I think there's often often people don't really consider them, but they may have heard them. And I think it's like advertising. You have to hear it several times before it really takes hold. So I just wanted to mention a few of these challenges. Restricted movement due to lack of space is a huge one, which I'll talk about in a second. Limited behavioral opportunities or forced idleness. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about a monkey that we rescued a few years ago that spent 12 years in a parrot cage in the back of a pet store near where I live. And that poor monkey had no behavioral opportunities and was in this state of forced idleness month after month, year after year, and had very detrimental consequences as a result. Reduced retreat space, so violation of fight or flight distance, forced proximity to humans. There's a number of these challenges faced by exotic animals. And one that I will add in there is too, that a lot of these animals have never been studied in the wild, so keeping them and developing appropriate husbandry protocols are done by trial and error, and that's not a way to do things. This is an example of, I can't remember what kind of python this is, but you can see that this is an accredited zoo in Canada, and you can see that they have not considered in this exhibit any of the 5 freedoms or any of the things that we've been discussed. And if you look at this pet setting on the right, you'll see that this is, I would say, a relatively typical type of situation that you'd find large constricting snakes in home settings. And as a Humane Society inspector, I got an opportunity to go into a lot of homes and to look at these animals, as well as in pet stores and other places. And I can attest from my own experience that this is how many of them are kept. And I wanted to show the contrast between what they're experiencing in this accredited zoo and in this home setting. I don't know if it's an anaconda, but I think we're going to show a video here, and it's being turned over to Jade because she has to start the video. Okay, you can see here, this is, and I've heard from a number of snake keepers that these large constricting snakes don't need any space. They're relatively terrestrial, so they're on the ground, or in the case of anacondas or others that frequent water bodies, that they're relatively sedentary. But there, is a wonderful example of this very large constricting snake, probably one of the outliers in terms of size, that's actually using that vertical dimension. And we have no idea how important that vertical dimension is to that snake. Next slide. I think there's a bit of a delay here in terms of jumping from video to back to slides. So So when you're looking at exotic pet welfare, there are a number of potential physical impacts. I've alluded to them. There are trauma during capture and transport. Just by virtue of being in captivity and not being able to do the things that you would normally do, there's all kinds of things related to loss of fitness, including musculature, cardiovascular fitness. A lot of animals have real mobility problems if they're put into better environments after living for long periods in very impoverished environments. They just don't have the capacity to actually do what they're supposed to do. Can be retarded growth, dental issues, obesity I mentioned. There's all kinds of potential problems physically that can manifest in animals that are in these poor environments. Next. And then, of course, there's psychological impacts as well. And we now know that many animals experience these negative emotional states. So in the case of the squirrel monkey in this, basically what amounts to a bird cage, you know, that squirrel monkey could experience loneliness, frustration, anxiety, fear. Boredom is a huge concern of mine for animals in captivity. You know, animals did not evolve to wake up in the morning and do nothing. They evolved, you know, activities that they should be doing. They have evolved this whole complex suite of things that they do during the course of their daily lives, and that may even change on a weekly or a seasonal basis or from year to year. You know, and when they can't do these things, they have all these negative emotional states. And many of them manifest themselves in a variety of ways. Most people have heard of stereotypic behaviors, which are basically meaningless, repetitive movements that are divorced usually from their original stimulation. So that stimulation could be boredom. So it could be like the bear pacing in the zoo or the elephant rocking back and forth. But certainly we see a lot of these behaviors in exotic pets as well. We see hypersexuality, we see coprophagia, you know, eating their excrement, and we see point tipping in birds, loop pushing in snakes. My colleague that I mentioned earlier, Clifford Warwick, has developed a whole list of all of these aberrant behaviors that are expressed in reptiles that are in less than optimal circumstances. And virtually all of these animals, including fish, will display at least some of these aberrant behaviors. Next. Now, I wanted to show two quick videos because a lot of people, you know, may have seen a bear pace or, you know, another type of aberrant behavior, maybe not recognized what it is. But I wanted to show you a video I took. It's a very grainy video at the reptile house in the Buffalo Zoo that shows what's called ITB, or interaction with transparent boundaries. And Michele had brought that up earlier, and you can see in the left-hand corner there, if we can get the video to work, there's yeah, you can turn the sound off. So you can see that lizard is focused on the glass. A lot of reptiles seem to have an inability, it seems to be hardwired in some way in their brains that they cannot understand that they can't get through transparent boundaries. So you will see many of these reptiles, particularly the highly mobile lizards, wide-ranging tortoises, many of the aquatic turtles, that spend disproportionate amounts of time at the glass trying to get through. This is something that most people don't recognize, and most of the well, I've never met a reptile keeper who knew about it, because most of them think it's fine and don't see as abnormal this interaction with the transparent boundaries that confine these animals. And some of them are not that obvious. This is very subtle. These are turtles at the Toronto Zoo in their African pavilion. And it took a while, but I went back many times during the day, and these turtles were still focused on the glass. Now, sometimes their patterns along the glass were broken, but then they always came back. And this was something that was far more subtle that nobody who was looking at them really recognized. So they can be more subtle and harder to recognize than that other lizard that we saw that was moving, you know, quite frantically along the glass. A lot of the behaviors you really need to have a bit of an understanding of them and spend some time trying to learn to recognize them, because they are a bit more difficult, particularly if you're not familiar with the animals. Okay, I think we can go back to the regular slideshow there. Okay. Now, I always like to contrast the lives of these animals in captivity with the lives of their counterparts in the wild. And I was in Death Valley in 2016 and was up on this mountainside and came across this sagebrush lizard and ended up watching this lizard for quite a period of time. Well, I don't really like to observe reptiles or other animals in captivity, except professionally, of course. I am a bit of a field herper. I like to watch these animals in the wild. And this one covered quite a large area while I was watching it. It was in the neighborhood of tens, if not maybe 100 meters, square meters of area. It moved up and down vertically into rock crevices. It did a lot of things. It blended into its environment beautifully. This is really what we should be looking at to think, okay, how can we look at this and let it inform how, or even if we should keep animals in captivity? And this is something that generally doesn't seem to be done with exotic pets. So space is something that I think is grossly underestimated in its level of importance to animals. And you'll often hear that, well, the animal doesn't need a lot of space. It doesn't need to go find food. It doesn't need to evade predators. So we don't need to give it as much space as, you know, it may need in the wild or possibly in other circumstances. But if you look at most exotic animals, you find that they inhabit spaces that are orders of magnitude greater in size than they experience in captivity. And granted, like, we all understand that we're not going to be able to provide the same level of space in captivity as those animals experience in the wild, but we have to do a better job. Most exotic pets don't have enough space, and some of them have such limited space that they can't even make normal postural adjustments to their body, and that's been normalized in the exotic pet trade. Now, when you're looking at space, I think there are 3 questions that everybody should ask, and those questions are, is there enough space for the animal to express normal movements and behaviors? And I think when, again, if you look at most exotic pet situations and you are informed by what that animal does in the wild, you're going to say, no, they can't. The second question is, does that animal have enough space to feel safe and secure? And that can be from you as the pet owner, you know, from being from observation. It can be from its counterparts in the same enclosure. It can be from enclosures next, like betta fish that are, you know, put in cups beside each other, and you know, they don't like that. So, you know, do they have enough space to feel safe and secure? And then the third question is, what are the consequences of not providing enough space? So you really have to think about space, but I think space is grossly underestimated when it comes to the husbandry of exotic pets, and even in a lot of zoos, space is underestimated. I think that a lot of problems could be solved if animals had more space. And when you think about it, there's really no downside to providing too much space for an animal, but there's a huge downside to not providing enough space. And we can see in professional breeding operations, whether it's for geckos or ball pythons or whatever, space is not, or doesn't seem to be, very well considered at all. These animals are warehoused. They don't even have enough space to achieve a straight line body posture to make normal postural adjustments. And this is ubiquitous. You see it in retail settings where it's marginally better. Often, you know, what's in these enclosures and retail outlets is largely cosmetic, doesn't have a lot of biological relevance to the animals, but yeah, it's marginally better. And then as Michele mentioned in pet expos, you look at these crested geckos, they can't even make normal postural adjustments. It's outrageous. There should be zero tolerance for this. And then when you look at home settings, you know, you've got your typical aquarium setup, you've got wide-ranging land tortoises that, you know, don't have a lot of space. You've got these so-called habitats where, as my colleague I've mentioned earlier, Clifford Warwick said, yeah, doesn't it look like they're just dying to get in there? I don't think so. And then you've got these drawer and rack systems for the collectors that have multiple animals. None of these are appropriate. You know, we have to do a better job. And then it doesn't just apply to reptiles, which I'm picking on. We have these frogospheres for African clawed frogs. We've got bird stands where deflighted macaws and other parrots and other kinds of birds are kept. We've got the Siamese fighting fish in cups. And many people buy them from the retail outlet and keep them in similar analogous kinds of conditions. We've got birds in cages. This is right across the board when we're looking at the husbandry of these animals, and a lot of it is convenience-based husbandry, and it's affordable for customers, so that's why they have this. If you were to provide an appropriate environment for a macaw or a cockatoo, it wouldn't be this kind of situation, or it wouldn't be a large cage. It would be something entirely different. Now, one of the ways to illustrate space and scale that I think is very good is to look at circumstances where it is provided. So this is at the Oakland Zoo, and this is an exhibit that had some reptilian species and some amphibian species. And this was, I believe, if my memory is correct, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 or 10 meters long and maybe a meter and a half wide. Quite complex. It had, you know, a vertical dimension to it through the furnishings, natural substrates, microclimates. It had quite a variety of terrain. And if you look at the lower one, you had the same. You have a similar kind of thing with small reptilian species, some amphibians. And this is what we should be aiming for if we're talking about husbandry. This should be the standard. And I want to show you, just to show you scale. If you look at this enclosure, in that corner there, you see a small red blob. That is a Latin American frog. I don't know if it's a poison dart frog or what species it is. It might be a golden frog. But you can see the scale. This enclosure is thousands of, or hundreds, perhaps 1,000 times longer than this animal. This is the scale that we should be advocating, even for people who want to keep these animals in their home. They have to be able to provide the space and environment to satisfy the animal's needs and to ensure good welfare according to those 3 tenets of animal welfare. So this is the scale. And unfortunately, we see in many other situations like zoos where they don't have that scale. When we were advocating for better standards for dolphins in Ontario, the government had come up with a standard that was 1.5 times the length of the animal's body. We have seen referenced in numerous places for reptiles that the cage has to be 2 times the length of the animal's body. That is not scientific. That is not validated by anything. That is arbitrary. That is convenience-based, and it's absurd. We have to change this idea about space. And I think that will help us mitigate many of the other problems that result from it. A couple of other good circumstances. This was at a zoo where they had smaller monitor lizards, and they'd taken an old seal exhibit and provided space and complexity of environment. So a very different kind of situation than a jewel exhibit behind glass, you know, in a wall or in a home situation. We have to be thinking like this when we're thinking about all these exotic animals. Other situations, this one's pretty primitive, but this is for a small desert tortoise. You can see there's some variety, natural terrain. There's an ability at least for the animal to engage in some exploratory and foraging behaviors. The same here in the other picture. You can see it doesn't need to be high tech or you know, cost a lot. If you give some thought to it, you can provide a decent type of accommodation that at least moves you towards having a better degree of welfare. And then this is an iguana, and most times people see iguanas in an aquarium, but you know, an aquarium's no good. You know, they really need environments where they can move vertically, where they can, if they're frightened, dive into a water body, where they can do things that iguanas do. And this is just an up-close picture of a green iguana in a large conservatory setting where the animal is able to move up and down the trees. It has natural substrates. It can do many of the things that it really should be able to do. And I think it's very important to remember that regardless of how good the captivity is, Gordon Burkhardt is very famous in animal behavior circles and in reptile circles. And I think his quote here, that no captive environments can ever hope to fully simulate or mimic those of wild species, even for the smallest and most sedentary species. All we can really do is to work within the parameters of controlled deprivation. I think that's a very important quote to remember, and if we take it to heart, then we will always try to improve, whether we're an exotic pet keeper ourselves or whether we're working in a zoo or aquarium. So how do you assess animal welfare? Well, a lot of the sessions in the next round next week are going to discuss sort of the nitty-gritty of assessing, what to look for if you're doing inspections and all that. So I want to cover just some general things and then provide, to close, a few comments about what we should do in terms of regulatory objectives that will aid in increasing exotic pet welfare. But potential welfare indicators, there's a number of them. This may not be all of them, but one way that people assessed how animals were doing was to just basically look at them and see, is their fur intact? Are their feathers looking healthy? Do they have a robust body? How are they moving? Are they eating, drinking? How long are they living? Those are things that sort of have been done for a long time, and there's some value in that, certainly, but on their own, it may be better to add in other ways of looking to assess welfare. A second way that's very common, we saw this when we were battling the circus. They had focused entirely on trying to assess welfare using physiological processes. So blood hormone levels and respiration and heart rate in tigers that were in beast wagons moved from town to town. And they didn't look at anything else. So, most of these in isolation, they have value, but it should really be part of a suite of ways of looking at animal welfare. So physiological processes, so the respiration, heart rate, stress hormone levels, things like that are very valuable and can be useful in assessing animal welfare. Behavioral indicators of welfare or lack of welfare. So are they engaged in species typical movements, behaviors? Are they doing things that they really should be doing? There are some people that conduct preference studies. Does the fish prefer the tank that's got a lot of aquatic foliage in it, or does it prefer something else? So you can test animals on an individual basis and see, what do they like more? What do they prefer? That's sort of a laborious and slow way, not really applicable if you've got, large numbers or a very short period of time, but you can look at that. And of course, I've mentioned, you can look at how does that animal live in the wild and compare that to what that animal's life is like in captivity. And again, it's not going to be the same, but that wildlife of the animal can inform how we look at that captive life. So is there an easy way to assess animal welfare and conditions? No. It's something that many people are working on. There are lots of systems that have come forward. What I would advise everybody when you're looking at this, to always use the precautionary principle to basically do no harm, especially if you don't have scientific consensus or you don't have proof that something is not going to help that animal or make that animal's life better. So animal welfare assessment framework, systems and audit programs. There's the 5 domains model. Many of you may have heard of that. Individual zoos, aquariums, sanctuaries often have their own audit systems. Governments do, often under legislation. They will have regulations that are meant to ensure compliance with laws and with standards that they've developed. You've got other things that are useful, like the E-mode pet suitability assessment process. That's one of the easiest I've ever encountered. It was developed by my colleague who I've mentioned, Clifford Warwick at the Emergent Disease Foundation. It provides a numerical scoring based on a number of criteria for exotic animals to see, generally, do they work as pets or not? I think that's a very valuable one to look for. But a lot of these systems really require somebody who has some background or expertise, preferably not somebody that's, been entrenched in folklore husbandry, but somebody who has that animal welfare or science background. And as I said, there's no shortcuts. So proactive solutions, what can you do? I've come up with 5 things sort of that are broader things. Prohibition on the keeping and sale of exotic wild animals. That's certainly something we advocate for. Utilization of positive list regulatory programs, establishing care management and safety standards, restricting certain uses of exotic animals, and then always in everything, moving beyond the consideration of that first tenet of animal welfare, the biological functioning of the animal, and including those other things about animal welfare in policymaking discussions, enforcement, delivery, and certainly in public education activities. We've got to get people not thinking these animals are easy to keep. So prohibit wild animals from being kept or sold. The benefit is that it's comprehensive. If the animal's not there, there's no problem. And I think that's one of the strongest things that we can do. It's not always practical, but certainly in some circumstances it is. And a lot of communities have gone that way, as have other jurisdictions to one degree or another. Positive lists, which Michele Hamers will be talking about in the 3rd group of sessions in this webinar series. They are lists that, instead of saying what animals you can't have, it's telling you what animals the public can have. And personally, I think they're one of the most effective ways for dealing with the regulation of animals generally in any jurisdiction. I think they're fair. They're preventative. They do apply the precautionary process. They utilize an evidence-based approach to animal welfare. They're evolving and flexible. And what they do is put governments or other agencies that are delivering that regulatory program in the power position. In the past, if somebody wanted to get an animal and exploit it in a community or keep it, and it wasn't on a prohibited list, they would be fine to do that. Well, under a positive list, if that animal wasn't on the positive list, then the person who wanted to keep or use or exploit that animal, they would have to do all the work to prove that it is acceptable to put it on the list. So it really puts the onus on doing the work to get something on the list on the people who want to exploit them, instead of municipalities or groups like my own or World Animal Protection coming in and trying to do all the work. It's I think, very fair, and it's a very legitimate process, and it is spreading around the world. Housing care and standards, there's some merit in them. It's probably good to want to educate people how to care for animals, but as Michele Hamers said, there are literally thousands and thousands of species. Many of them have very specialized needs. Many of them have needs that are not known, and many of them have needs that in no way, shape, or form could ever be replicated in a home setting unless you were somebody with very large volumes of money. So it's just not realistic for many of these to come up with standards. And I think it's problematic because most jurisdictions, the agencies that enforce policy and regulations, won't have the expertise. They may have a little bit of it, but they'll fall far short. So it will be very difficult to enforce. So housing and care standards, I think in a general sense, it can be fine to have principles that should be adhered to, but I'm not a big fan of the individual jurisdictions doing them. And there are other measures restricting businesses, not supporting convenience-based housing and husbandry standards. That can be a municipal animal shelter, not telling people that, hey, the bird cage is okay for the bird when it's not, or the tiny aquarium is okay for the frog or the reptile when it's not. So there are a number of things that can be done. I think they're all things that people should take to heart and should think about in every facet of this issue and their involvement in it. Now, I just want to finish by, and I've never actually done this before, but I'm making this presentation in memory of Miko and Eugene. 35 years ago, Miko, the monkey underneath the title there, that's the monkey that, a white-nosed guenon monkey, African species, that had spent 12 years in this parrot cage. He had developed a huge pot belly. He did nothing. He was basically in a state of learned helplessness, and he was behind glass, so he lived in an auditory vacuum. He couldn't see anything, and we were able to get him out of there. And I think that, back in those days, it was all guys like Miko that we dealt with. Now we have to think of the tegu lizards and the African crab frogs and all the other creatures. The other one that was more recent is this handsome old guy on the right. His name's Eugene. And if you look at this picture of him looking out the window, he came into that room when he was 1 year old. He spent 26 years in that room looking through that glass at a hallway and a wall. He had no other companionship, never saw another monkey. The ammonia smell in the room was horrendous. The furnishings were static and not changing. And basically he spent all his time just looking out the window. I would surmise probably wishing he could get out and do something. Well, we got him out of there, and he went to a fabulous primate sanctuary called the Fauna Foundation and lived the last remaining years of his life next to other monkeys. He would go up and for the first time in his life be able to go into the sunshine and lie there, and he would pull all his blankets together and make a bed. And I hope he was a happy old man. He isn't alive anymore, but I think, we've still got to work on the residue of what's left in terms of these more charismatic animals, but now we also have to turn our attention to all of these other creatures as well. They deserve consideration. The science says they deserve consideration. There's great receptiveness in the political arena, even if that's not manifested in all of the policies, regulations, and laws that we would want to see. It is there. It is growing. There is room for optimism. I think we can make a difference in changing the lives of these animals, and I hope you all do too. So I'm going to stop there. I don't know how long I've spoken, but thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Rob. You are doing just fine on time, not to worry at all.
Okay, great.
So as you can imagine, we've got a number of questions for you as well. So let me just start off with Ariel. And she was wondering about the Gambian pouch rats. How do you feel programs like Hero Rats and the potential of this species to be trained for future search and rescue in areas outside of their origin, climate, and country, are these now considered a domestic species? So there's two questions. How do you feel about them being used for search and rescue? And would you now consider these a domesticated species?
I wouldn't think they would qualify it. I certainly haven't done the assessment for Gambian pouch rats, but I wouldn't think they would qualify as domesticated species. Domestication isn't something that occurs rapidly or easily, and many animals that have been in that domestication process, they failed to become domesticated. And certainly Gambian pouch rats and other rats and lots of other animals can become very tame. I think for many of them that are highly social, like rats are, there is an ability to develop some kind of a relationship with them. I don't think it's a suitable replacement for relationships with other Gambian pouch rats. I think it's sort of a default relationship that will fill some facet of the social needs of that animal, but won't necessarily fill them all. But you know, for many of those types of situations, I think it's a matter of weighing the benefit and the needs of the animals. And certainly for me, the needs of the animals outweigh most of these kinds of uses. But I recognize that not everybody thinks like me. And there are mitigating factors. There may be people that are very concerned about animal welfare, but they see that there is this tremendous benefit to utilizing the animals in this way. All I would say to anybody who sees that there's this benefit, that there's this need, this way of using animals, that we do everything that we can, if it is to occur, to make sure that as many of the welfare needs of the animals are met as can be met. And if they can't be met, I don't think they should be used.
That's great. Okay, next from Tracy Tom. The majority of municipalities in Ontario have specific sections in their bylaws in regards to exotic pets, which are prohibited and restricted. And the bylaw officers are on the front line when it comes to the removal and enforcement of these laws in regards to these animals. However, there are many municipalities that don't have any bylaws regarding exotics. So how do we change that? And is it those municipalities that tend to thrive in the illegal breeding of animals? So that's an interesting question. Whether the lack of bylaws then automatically assumes, or does that mean illegal breeding happens in those municipalities?
Well, in the early days, we didn't find that. We found that there wasn't really a lot of difference between the municipalities that had prohibited animal lists or other types of regulatory regimes for exotics and those that didn't. And I think the reason for that was that these animals were just not on the radar. The only time they came on the radar was when, you know, somebody brought a tiger into their backyard and the neighbors were concerned about their safety. Then these bylaws would be looked at, or if they existed in an appropriate way, would be enforced. But no, we didn't find any difference. Today, it's a little bit different. We find that, and this is all anecdotal. We haven't actually surveyed this, but this is just anecdotal. We believe that for, you know, the shift towards the smaller exotics, that's still not on the radar screen of most municipalities, and that's because they're not so obvious. You can keep a wallaby in a backyard, you can keep 300 snakes in a basement, and if you're crafty about it, your neighbor doesn't even need to know. So these smaller animals are not on the radar. But the other animals that used to be here in abundance, when they are going into municipalities, then the municipalities are more often than not jumping on it. They do not want these animals anymore. Many of them do have prohibited lists. Those that don't actually will pass them. And in fact, we had a case last year where a private individual brought a bunch of big cats into a municipality, and I believe it was about 3 days later, council held a special bylaw and passed a bylaw to prohibit that. So when we're looking at the sort of the bigger, dangerous, charismatic animals of old, there's a lot of attention and certainly enforcement when it comes to those animals, but we still have that whole suite of animal species, these smaller ones that are still largely off the radar. And when you look at most of those animals, except some of the mammals, you'll find that most of them are not on the prohibited lists of bylaws. Typically, you'll find large constricting snakes and venomous reptiles, but none of the other 11,341 species of reptiles are banned. You usually find no fish species banned. You find usually no amphibian species banned, and you typically find only a few birds. They tend to be pheasants, chickens, those kinds of birds, as well as raptorial birds, so eagles, owls, hawks, and the ratites, so emus and rheas and those kinds of birds. And all of the other 10,000 species of birds are allowed. So a lot of the animals that are out there now, the bylaws don't even consider them.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question is from Hannah. In 2004, in her fourth year DVM rotation, zoo and wildlife medicine, students were still being taught that surgeries involved in cosmetically crippling flighted birds so they could not fly out of zoo enclosures. Is this still common practice? Oh, sorry, so still being taught surgeries involved in cosmetically crippling.
I don't know about veterinary schools teaching the procedure, but certainly it's common. I would say that there is some emerging discussion about the pinioning of birds and whether it's ethical or not. And some people, even within the zoo community itself, have come out and said, no, it's not. We shouldn't be surgically mutilating birds just so we can display them. We just have to build better cages, whether they're large aviaries or conservatories or whatever. So there is some discussion, but you do see it. You do see individuals that are grappling with birds that are problematic because they're aggressive or they want to do things that they normally do as birds and can't, that have their birds as a management tool pinioned, or they have their flight feathers cut so that they render them only partially able to fly or completely flightless. I think that's completely unethical for anybody, whether it's a pet owner or a zoo. Birds, need to fly. And I think when you look at the exotic pet trade, you see this almost ubiquitously with parrots, particularly the large parrots, where it seems to be accepted practice that you basically take away the two most important facets of their life, flight and their social context. I've talked to field biologists that study parrots, whether they're in Latin America or Asia, and they say that parrots, they're like elephants or orcas. They spend virtually their entire lives with other birds. And you can't, if you're ethical and compassionate and scientific, you can't say that it's okay to keep them alone. So it's now I've forgotten the question.
No, I think you've answered it. I think it's
okay.
good.
Okay. Good.
All right.
Good.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, Rob, is I'm going to ask a couple more questions because we do have that the last speaker, which is a full hour of his video, and I do want to give people a quick break. But then maybe I can ask you to do the same as Michelle and just answer the questions in the break. Great. Awesome. So this is an anonymous question, which is great. The 5 freedoms are considered to be an antiquated way of viewing animal welfare as they focus on negative welfare states. Laidlaw's and Beausoleil's approach using the 5 domains model is a more positive way of evaluating animal welfare. So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I agree. As I mentioned in the presentation, I think the 5 freedoms were a very useful starting point for deliberations on animal welfare and what are the components that constitute, good animal welfare. And I think the 5 domains have a different kind of focus, and they are, I would think, based on the discussions that have occurred and all of the stuff that's been published over the years, they're a natural progression and a very much needed progression. And I think we'll probably see more as we move forward into the future. The debate isn't over. We can't know everything about animals. We're finding things out, but we can't crawl into their heads, and certainly we can't know what's really happening to them, what's going on in their minds. And I think as we learn more, then the 5 domains will be revised, and there will be other systems come forward. And there's a lot of stuff in the academic literature on that. And I think it's great. We have to be receptive to new ideas, to new ways of doing things, to new assessment, to new science. And if we're not, we're being irresponsible. So yeah, I totally agree with the premise of the question.
Great. Okay, so last question, and then we'll take a quick break. If an accredited zoo is keeping reptiles in substandard conditions, how do I, as an animal welfare inspector, convince an owner their husbandry practices are inadequate?
Very good question, and it is very challenging because as an animal welfare inspector, you often come into a situation, and I've been in a situation where, you don't have that requisite level of education experience, practical knowledge, etc., with the particular species that you're concerned about. So, this is something that both World Animal Protection and ourselves are trying to address. Creating tools and resources that are understandable and accessible and practical, that enforcement people who face these kinds of challenges can use. And I think it's one of the most important things that we're trying to do now, because there are so many people out there. They can be working in municipal animal control departments. They may be activists from local groups who, think there's a problem but can't really articulate what that problem is. It could be Humane Society inspectors, it could be others, but it's very challenging now. There are ways that others will be discussing in the coming sessions. Personally, what many of my colleagues have advocated is that it's just a matter of doing all the research, having that empirical data prepared, and if the people who are doing this, whether it's an accredited zoo or anywhere else, if they're open, if they're honest, then hopefully they'll consider what's being said and change. When it comes to enforcement, going into the courts and all that, I think there's a whole other set of hurdles that we're going to have to face. And those, we're just starting with tiny baby steps to address them by getting, welfare concepts and that entrenched in legislation, in regulations and policy, and in, deliberations in government bodies, whether it's councils or provincial parliaments or whatever. We're just starting to address some of these other things. So I think there's huge challenges, but we're working on it. We've been giving a lot of thought to this, and we expect to have some very helpful tools available very, very soon for exactly this kind of thing that's been asked in the question.
That's fantastic. Thanks. Okay, with that, we're going to say thank you to Rob. As I mentioned, he's going to go and I think there's 7 questions there for you, Rob, to kind of look through the answers to. And we're going to take a 5-minute break. So at 2:35 sharp, we'll be starting the final session for today, which is an interview with Dr. Marc Bekoff. So we will be back in 5 minutes. Okay, Jade, I think we're ready to get started again. So as Jade is loading the video, I will just give a brief introduction to what we're going to be seeing. The final speaker, and he is in a pre-recorded interview. Our final speaker today is Dr. Marc Bekoff. Marc has published 31 books, won many awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, compassionate conservation, and animal protection, and is a former Guggenheim Fellow. Marc's latest books are Canine Confidential, Why Dogs Do What They Do, and Unleashing Your Dog, a field guide to guiding your canine companion the best life possible, with Jessica Pierce. And he's also publishes regularly for Psychology Today. Marc and Jessica have recently written a book about what the world will be like for dogs when humans disappear, called Dogs Gone Wild, Imagining the Lives of Dogs in a World Without Humans. In 1986, Marc won the Masters age grade in Tour de France, and if you're interested in learning more about him, his homepage is marcbekoff.com. So that's MarcBekoff.com. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jade, and we'll start the video, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Hello, everyone. We are pleased to start our conversation about animals with renowned animal behavior scientist, Dr. Marc Bekoff. Dr. Bekoff is a professor emeritus of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Colorado. He has published 31 books, including The Animal's Agenda, and has received many awards for his research on animal behavior, animal emotions, compassionate conservation, and animal protection. You may already know a lot about Dr. Bekoff, following him quite closely if you're an animal welfare advocate. What you may not know is he's also won the Tour de France in his age category. And of course, more information about this incredible professor, scientist, and advocate for animals can be found at marcbekoff.com. But thank you, Dr. Bekoff, for taking the time to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you. This looks like an easy one for me.
We have a great audience for you for this workshop. And, you know, you're an animal behavior scientist, but what is it that prompted you to also become an advocate for animals?
Well, first of all, I'm really an ethologist and a behavioral ecologist. The only reason I'd mention that is because in a lot of universities, animal behavior science or animal science is really a program in how to kill animals, you know, agricultural farm animals. But what prompted me was probably in my genes. My parents tell me that when I was a kid growing up in Brooklyn, New York, of all places where there weren't many non-human animals, I was always talking to the dogs and cats and birds and mice and ants and other non-human animal beings in my neighborhood. And they allowed me to do that. My mother was very compassionate and empathic, and my father was really a great optimist. So I got something from them. And that's how it all started. I talked to them years ago about those experiences, and I wrote a book called Minding Animals that really came from those conversations, where minding animals means minding them, taking care of them, and minding them, attributing minds to them because they're thinking and feeling beings.
So it started at a very early age, and your mother had a lot to do with it as well.
She did. She never quite grabbed where I was going with it later on. But she was infinitely tolerant.
Oh, wow. Animal welfare is a big topic around the world, and I've read that you promote the use of the term animal well-being. Can you explain why you use that term?
Yeah, animal welfare really gives license to abusing animals. It's a form of utilitarian philosophy. So if the costs of the research or work or using animals, non-human animals, outweighs the benefits, you don't do it. But if the benefits outweigh the cost, it's okay. But the benefits are usually cashed out in terms of benefits to humans. So really, I always say animal welfare fails millions and billions of animals, because it really does allow for them to be used as long as we're doing the best for them. Animal well-being, which also forms the basis for compassionate conservation, stresses that the life of every single individual matters because they have intrinsic or inherent value. Their life matters because they're alive, not because of what they can do for us, which is usually called their instrumental value. So really, not for everyone, but I'd say for Jessica Pierce and I, we developed that idea in a book called The Animal's Agenda. It really means that no more killing, no more harming, no more mutilating in the name of humans. Because what most people don't realize is that very little that's done is really in the name of the animals themselves. I mean, people can make up all sorts of excuses, like keeping animals in zoos for education and supposed conservation reasons. But in the end, little, if anything, really comes back to the non-humans themselves. So that's really the distinction. And it's a really important distinction because we're not futzing around with costs and benefits. We're really saying that the very life of every individual matters because they're alive. I mean, it's pretty simple.
You mentioned compassionate conservation. Can you tell us more about what exactly that means? Is that a relatively new area of science?
It's relatively new. The ideas behind it have been around for a while. The first formal meeting about compassionate conservation was in 2010 at University of Oxford in England. The basic tenets of compassionate conservation, and it applies to zooed animals. Jessica and I call animals in zoos zooed animals in the Animals Agenda. The basic premises are, first, do no harm. The life of every single individual matters. And the overall goal is seeking peaceful coexistence based on no harm. I mean, you could always argue that when we interfere in any way in the life of a non-human, we may be harming them. But I think it's clear in a practical sense that it means no harm. And so, once again, it gets back to the science of animal well-being. They actually developed independently, relatively independently, but then one night I saw their link there that it's the life of every individual that really matters.
Sounds a lot like ecology. Is it really ecology, the principles of ecology blended with animal ethics?
Well, it depends what kind of ecology, because I'm a field biologist and I work with ecologists who don't think twice about going out and trapping and harming and marking and otherwise interfering in the lives of the non-humans with whom they're working. So I've never really made that connection. I just think that compassionate conservation and animal well-being brings the attention back to each individual animal, which basically means that you don't harm an animal for the good of other members of their species. For example, which once again gets back to zooed animals. The myth, the lie that animals kept in cages in zoos are ambassadors for their species.
Right.
They're not. Sorry.
That's often, I was just thinking that's often these animal ambassadors that are used for education and you see them brought into school classrooms. Zoos are still popular for school trips. What do you say to that claim that trips to the zoo and seeing wild animals in captivity is an educational benefit, that it's important for conservation?
I think it depends on the teacher. I've gotten into debates with these about this question. When kids go to zoos, they might learn something about the animal who they're watching in the cage. I mean, that's a given. They may learn something. They're surely not learning what life is like for that animal in the wild where they live. And they're surely not looking at an ambassador. The one lesson that comes across, though, is that it's okay to keep other animals in cages for our entertainment and supposed benefit. So I've worked with teachers coming from different sides of the agenda, if you will. And the better teachers are very open about it. You know, they'll say, okay, this is a chimpanzee, or this is a bird kept in a small aviary, or this is a snake kept in a barren aquarium. And then they'll talk about the life histories and the way these animals live. And when I've accompanied them, which hasn't been very recently because I haven't been to zoos recently, but when I accompany them, some of the better teachers will say, but we want you to understand that, you know, it's not normal to see 6 elephants in a cage. And then the zoo people will say, no, it's an enclosure, but it's a cage. You know, they'll say, well, we just increased the size of it from, you know, 1 acre to 10 acres. It doesn't matter. It's a cage. So they give both sides, and kids want both sides. The other thing that I've learned is that when kids leave the zoo, it's very rare for them to say, oh, that animal or a particular animal looked happy. When they reflect on it, they'll, and they're allowed to talk openly, they'll talk about the restrictions on the different freedoms of the animals. Mm-hmm. And then when they learn that the animals are shipped around as mating machines, and you might not tell a young kid that, but they know that, or they'll see 2 cute polar bears at the Denver Zoo, which is about an hour from me. And then all of a sudden the polar bear babies aren't there, and they've been separated so that they can go to other zoos, make more money, and maybe breed. Mm-hmm. So I think it depends on the teacher. So I can't say that I'm 100% against these visits, because I think they could have the benefit of displaying what zoos really are and have long-term benefits on kids' attitudes.
Right.
I mean, that's really how I feel. I've never worked with a teacher, and not only in Boulder, but actually in Europe too, who's been gung-ho about these trips, or after the trips when kids ask questions. I've never worked with a teacher who's tried to lie to them, because that's what it is. I mean, you can cut through the chase. So that's good. So it might be the only opportunity for some kids to even see an individual of a given species. And do I think that's good? Well, yeah, I think it's good for them to see them, as long as they get the true story. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I guess, you know, zoos promote the idea that they're good. They're doing a service for educating people about the species, and to promote an awareness and interest and passion for conserving the species in the wild. That's a different thing. What you're saying is, you can actually, if zoos are there, why not use it with kids to explain what the animal really has in their enclosure or cage and doesn't have. You can turn it around.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Absolutely. I mean, they're, like you said, they're linked together, but, you know, there's really not any real great evidence that zoos play any educational role. I mean, we all know people who say that I went to the zoo when I was a kid, or I know someone and I became a biologist. Big deal. I'm glad they became a biologist. But the point is, the bottom line is are they making a contribution to the well-being or betterment of the life of individuals later on? And that once again, I'm not saying that's a justification for the zoos, because I think there's other ways to learn about animals and to use that information on behalf of the animals. But no, there's really no evidence there.
Right.
The conservation side, I think, gets a little trickier. There are some zoos and zoological associations that support some pretty good field work, for example, including non-invasive field work. So my take on it is to look at each individual zoo and figure out what they're doing in the conservation area, okay? I mean, I know some people disagree with me, but really, like, there are some conservation and zoological societies that put a lot of money into non-invasive field work. So let's look at what they're doing. So I'm not much of a generalist, so I would just say, if you want to know something about a zoo or a zoological association or society, find out what they're doing and then go from there. But
right, okay.
That's not to justify the existence of zoos, though.
Sure, no, I get it. Point taken.
I want to be careful there.
Now, you've written and talked a great deal about animal emotions. What is it that you think is the most important for people to know?
To me, the most important thing that people should know is that these animals are sentient feeling beings. They experience a whole panoply of emotions, from joy and happiness and pleasure to grief and sadness and mourning and pain and suffering. So that's, to me, is the bottom line. It doesn't matter how smart they are. It doesn't matter all the tricks they can be taught. It really matters that they feel, not if they feel. And they really need to know that the key question would be, why have emotions evolved, not if they have evolved. They're there. So people who go, we really don't know if some of these animals suffer, I'm thinking, God, I mean, they are so out of touch with science, reality, and common sense. And when people say that about animals, I'll say, do you live with a dog? And a lot of them live with a dog or a cat or another, say, companion animal. And I'll say, well, what about your dog? Oh, yeah, my dog. I know my dog has feelings. Well, what about the wolf or the elephant or the polar bear or the bird, the eagle, the snake? And when they say, I don't know, I usually say, I'm glad I'm not your dog. Because really, why be such a speciesist?
Mm-hmm.
So it comes down to the emotions and the feelings these animals have, not their, I suppose, intellectual skill, not that they can be taught to shoot a basket or figure out a puzzle to entertain the humans. Some of these games can be enriching for the animals, which is good because you want them to be enriched. But once again, I always stress that's not a reason for keeping them in cages.
Right. And so, I mean, our session that we're about to have is about wildlife kept in captivity. And we know that it's still popular in a variety of settings, whether wild animals are kept in zoos, aquariums, or by private people in their homes as pets. Knowing what you know about animals in the wild, how do you compare what their existence is like in captivity?
It's almost like a category error to make those comparisons. I mean, you see the same basic behavior patterns. As an ethologist, we develop what we call ethograms, would be lists of the actions the animals perform. So there's not much of a difference between animals, say wolves, coyotes, bears, lots of birds. There's not so much difference between the behavior patterns they actually perform. A lot of them are hardwired, a lot of them they just do, if you will. But the difference, of course, is that they're forced into cages. If they're social, they don't have any choice about the individuals with whom they form relationships or not. They're told when they can eat, what they can eat, where they can sleep, can they mate, are they allowed to do X, Y, or Z? So they've really lost this whole spectrum of freedoms. So from the behavior pattern point of view, the very basic actions they perform, there are similarities with wild relatives. The way in which they sort of spend their average day is radically different. And some people will say, well, it's a lot better in zoos. They get a meal, they get a free bed, and they get veterinary care. My take on the whole thing, and it's hard to ask these animals, is though it's probably a better life for them to be in the situation in which they evolved. So predators have to get food. Unfortunately, prey animals wind up as meals. But each of them has a whole suite of behavior patterns that have evolved according to lifestyle. So predators have evolved very complicated sometimes or simple ways of getting a meal. And prey animals have evolved this whole array of anti-predatory behaviors to avoid being taken. And I feel that an animal, to be a true representative or ambassador of the species, has to have the freedom to express those behavior patterns and others. So can you learn something from watching a group a made-up pack of wolves in captivity about how they interact? Yeah, you can. Does it have a lot of bearing on what they do in the wild? No.
You raise a good point about the animals are kept in they're provided food in the zoo. They have everything you would think they would need from humans there, and that is often the argument given for why they don't need so much space. We've heard that time and time again. Large, vast roaming animals like wolves that don't need a lot of space, and you see them in enclosure after enclosure, quite small compared to their natural ranges, not even close to their natural ranges. But the argument provided by zookeepers and zoo proponents is that they don't need anything more because they have those large territorial ranges to hunt. But if their food is provided, why is space important? What would you say to that?
I mean, that's absurd. That's like telling somebody, well, I'll give you food, and if you need medical care, I'll give you medical care, and I'll give you a bed at your house so you never have to roam and leave your house. I mean, I don't know anybody who would say that, anybody. So I think it's just a stupid rationalization or justification for keeping animals in captivity. I mean, part of the joy, and I've done field work on coyotes, I've watched wolves, I studied penguins in Antarctica, and I've studied birds around my house, is that they go off and roam. They go on hikes, they go on various trips. It's part of who they are. And you can't possibly provide that space, those spaces and the sorts of interactions they're going to have in captivity. Part of being a coyote is you go out on forays, you're looking for food, you may meet a strange coyote, you may meet a potential mate, you may meet a lost brother or sister or relative. And these are the kinds of things that we discovered over almost 9 years of studying wild coyotes outside of Jackson, Wyoming, that it's part of their day is to roam and go out. So sure, I mean, like I said, I mean, it's just so stupid and so anti-biological to say we give them what they need so they don't really need anything in terms of space. It's just ridiculous. Sorry. I mean,
I would say exotic pet collectors, for the most part, take that space issue to an extreme. We've seen vivariums for snakes, these simple glass tanks provided, or even worse than that, a plastic bucket at reptile expos. The argument is by some of these breeders and keepers is that snakes have all they need in these simple containment areas. They don't need to move. What do you say to that? What do you know about these more common exotic animals that are kept in people's homes as pets? These snakes, the fish, even. You take your average fish tank or fish bowl that you see at a pet store that's being sold. What do you know about the lives of these animals and what they need for a good life?
Oh, it's incredibly abusive. And these people feel that they can put these, individual beings in these situations without knowing anything about them. I've heard people say, oh, it's just a snake, just a turtle, just a fish. And I'm thinking, well, if it's just a snake, a turtle, or a fish, why would you put them on display if you don't even value their lives? So the bottom line is that they need to go out and I always say become fluent in whatever animal is at hand. So I work with dogs and coyotes and wolves a lot. So you become fluent in dog, coyote, or wolf. You become fluent in amphibian, lizard, anolis lizard, garter snake, boa constrictor, python. Whoever it is, you learn about them. But it's just a convenient lie. And so it gets back to the earlier question about going to zoos is kids see these animals in these little cages. And it's just the worst lesson they can ever have. Because sometimes you'll see a single animal and on the plaque, it'll say, these are social animals who travel a lot. And you've got one snake in a stupidly small a vivarium or aquarium or whatever you call them. And you're teaching the opposite lesson. You're saying, but it's okay to keep them here. No, it's not okay. You know, they don't like being there. I mean, the non-humans, not the kids, but the kids don't like it either. It's hard to fool kids these days. I do a lot of these roots and shoots programs because I work with Jane Goodall a lot in those programs. And I've had kindergarten kids ask me questions that blow my mind that are along the lines of what we're discussing. Is, wow, you know, I see snakes in my backyard. Sometimes I see them together, you know, they're social, you know, and then I went to the zoo and I saw the snake alone in a cage. And we were told that it was all okay because we gave them water and hot lights to warm them up, you know, as if they're sunning themselves.
Right.
So anybody who's worked with kids knows that they ask very, very complicated questions and you can't BS to them. They see right through it. And I think that's really, I think what I just said is really important. Because they're the future.
And why do you think that is? Or maybe the question is, what's wrong with adults? Is there something that, you know, kids observe that adults are deprogrammed not to see anymore?
Well, I mean, the educational system hasn't quite shut them down yet. But also, I mean, it's a great question because things haven't really changed for me over the years when I've done kids events. I mean, all over the world, you know, and they really haven't. Kids, on average, are curious naturalists. They want to learn about them. And remember a couple of years ago, I was riding my bike home up Boulder Canyon here, and I came across a bunch of little kids on their hands and knees looking at insects on the bike path. And so I stopped and I just said, "Oh, what are you all doing?" And the teacher was there. And they all said, "Oh, we're looking at the insects and we're putting them in this little box so we can draw them. And then we're putting them back exactly where we found them." And so, okay, somebody said, well, in the best of all possible worlds, they wouldn't be picking the insects up. And I understand that. But I'll tell you, talking to them was a hopeful moment because they knew that they had to put the ants, or there was a worm, back exactly where they found them. And I didn't know the teacher at the time, but I got to know her, and she was great. You know, she said, "Look, we got to get these kids outside. We got to get them out of the classroom." And I explained to them how important it is to respect the animals. So once again, somebody could say, "Oh, they shouldn't be doing this." And I could see reasons why they shouldn't. But the fact of the matter is they're going to. So teach them and give them an ethics course while you're doing it.
Right. No, that makes sense. And that gives me hope as well. If the youth are asking you those kind of questions, bringing it back to us. Well, I guess what I wanted to ask you as well is so we've talked about, you know, zoos and exotic pet keepers. Is there any ethical or legitimate reason that you see to keep wild animals in captivity? You know, if their freedoms are so restricted, where can it be justified ethically, in your opinion?
Only to rehabilitate them or rescue them if they've been harmed, especially by humans. So, you know, one of my long-term goals, or I wish it were a short-term goal for zoo reform, would be to turn them into sanctuaries or refuges. So sure. However, it gets tricky because in my field work, I've seen injured animals, and I'm just an observer. It breaks my heart when I've seen coyotes fight and a coyote get a bad bite. But if I'm going to go out there and rescue the animal who got bitten, then I am now part of the social system. And I've really interfered in, if you will, the natural social evolution of this group. And, you know, in a big picture, you could say of the species over time. So I think that the only reason for bringing these animals into captivity is, number one, if we've harmed them. And number two, there is just no other alternative. And, you know, as far as I can see, I don't work in zoos, but there's a lot of zoos who are trying to become more of sanctuaries and rescue centers, and for the animals, for their clients. So zoos should become client oriented that way. But the reasons I hear usually for keeping non-humans in cages and zoos are just lame. I mean, that's just my point of view. I don't think they do a fraction of the educational or conservation work that they claim to do. But I want to just be clear again, because like I said before, that there are some zoological societies that do put money into really good field work. So once again, it gets back to the bottom line, taking everything on a case-by-case basis. However, not justifying the existence of zoos as we know them today.
Right.
Yeah.
And most of our audience, I think, for these workshops, we're going to have a lot of animal control officers and humane society inspectors and other people involved in enforcement of animal welfare laws. They don't know as much about exotic wild animal welfare as they would about domesticated animals, cats and dogs, other common animals. What would your best advice for them be in terms of where to start, how to learn about these issues in their role? Same with policymakers too.
Yeah, there's so much information online. There's great books. I've got books on my shelf about reptile behavior, amphibian behavior. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a book out there on exotic, just a general book. Clifford Warwick in the UK, Gordon Burghardt in Tennessee in the United States, and a whole lot of other people are experts on the behavior of these animals and have written a lot on welfare and well-being. So don't use the animal, don't bring an animal in and then use that animal as some experiment for learning about them. Learn about them before you bring them in if they need to be brought in. I mean, that's just my point of view. And I know it's a difficult situation, but I'm always impressed with these wildlife officers and others who do the work that you're describing, who say, no, we're not taking this animal into captivity. There have been situations in my sort of area, carnivore biology, where wildlife officers and others have refused to shoot and kill bears who are, quote, problems. The real problems are the people, not the bears. So that's getting back to becoming fluent in dog, cat, anolis lizard, python snake, and that should be mandatory. Not like, oh, they're just an X, so this is all they need. Because that's really speciesist, and it's really harmful to the animals themselves to make those uninformed, uneducated, stupid judgments that these animals are only X, Y, or Z, so they don't really need anything but a light and an aquarium that's barren. So education, education, education. And people should refuse to do this kind of thing unless they feel really competent in knowing about the life histories and behavior of these animals and their needs of these animals.
And is our scientific research and understanding of these animals increasing?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah, I mean, I write a lot for Psychology Today, and the articles I write about sentience in amphibians and reptiles, invertebrates, and fishes, for example, are very popular. I mean, people really want to know about these animals. Number one, they feel that, they're always being lied to when they're told that these animals aren't smart, aren't emotional, and don't need a lot. Number two, how could anybody, I know it's a silly question sometimes, but how could anybody not be just amazed and just hungry to learn about the biodiversity in the world and learn that birds and fishes, mammals, of course, and invertebrates and reptiles and amphibians in the wild have very complex social lives. So sticking one animal in an aquarium doesn't cut it. I just think you put it out there and the people will come. I really, really do. And I'm hopeful that they will take in the information that's readily there. There's no excuses anymore. Just go on the web and look up snake sentience, ant pain, whoever these animals are, and there's an entire literature.
Excellent. Um, for many years, it's been challenging to get scientists and academics involved in advocacy for animals. What advice would you give them, those who are interested in being public advocates? How to, stick their neck out? What's the first step to take?
You have to have thick skin. You do. I've been doing this for a really long time. And it was part of what I began doing years ago when I started going to university, teaching at universities. I feel that every scientist should have to be an advocate for their species. And I used to have these arguments with people. I remember once I was giving a talk in Sydney, Australia, and I was talking about it's just murder. It's downright first-degree murder of kangaroos. And this guy in the audience said, "You're a scientist and you can't be an advocate." And I thought, and what came to me was, I'm an advocate for protecting them. You're an advocate for killing them. And the room got really silent. And I wasn't meaning to be a blank, but really, so it was okay if you could advocate and work to kill these animals or harm them, but it wasn't okay if you were an advocate to protect them. And that's just nonsense. And I've really written a lot that scientists have a responsibility to use the information that they gather on the behalf of the animals. And I've studied coyotes and various carnivores for decades. And I used to refuse to share certain data with certain groups like wildlife services in the United States. They called them animal damage control, and I just called them animal death corps because they just go out and murder animals. So I said, I'm not giving you this information. When it's published, it'll be available for public access. So that's what I think, that you are obliged to use that information on behalf of the animals who you are studying. And you are obliged to put that information out to the public, because I've always felt that, the questions you're asking and the people that visit zoos are not necessarily researchers or scientists. They're people who either are really interested in the animals or they're people who have nothing to do, so they go get cotton candy and popcorn and hang out at the zoo. But seriously, so I think that's how you get them involved. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people doing it, this kind of advocacy. Well, they get shamed by their colleagues. I used to get shamed by writing years ago articles on ethics and emotions. And I just thought, well, too bad. You do your good science and then you hand it out to the public. And I think that that's the way to do it. So I'm always encouraging my colleagues and ex-colleagues to do that. But unfortunately, there could be a price to pay by their narrow-minded, single-minded colleagues who they're blind to anything but their own sometimes useless research.
But it's an obligation. You need to grow thick skin. Did you always have that thick skin, or did it take some time?
I think I always had it, but I never really had to put it in practice until I left a graduate program that was, I sort of got blinded, I don't know what's that word, blindsided. I didn't realize that a program had a certain aspect to it. And I refused to partake in a lot of the practices that they were performing. And I got yelled at. This is what you do as a scientist. As a scientist, you have to do this or something like that. But then when I dropped out of it, was a PhD, MD program, and I went to work with a guy named Michael Fox years ago, who veterinarian and a PhD in psychology, and really one of the really early leaders in the animal welfare movement as an academic. It just all blended. It just did. And frankly, I used to tell my parents, I didn't care, that if people are going to yell at me for caring about the animals, it's their problem, not mine. So no, I always have felt that way, but it does take thick skin. When I started teaching here years ago, a graduate student and I started the first non-dissection labs in biology in my department. And some of my colleagues just say, "Oh, yeah, that's fine, let them do it." Some were really upset, and some just said, "Well, they'll never be popular." Well, it turned out that the non-dissection labs filled up before any of the others, and that was great. It was really good. And I started, when I taught, there was always an aspect of my animal behavior classes, which I've been teaching for decades, that dealt with, at the time, animal welfare, animal protection, animal well-being, and ethics, and always. And just a couple of months ago, it was before I was contacted by Rob and Julie about this, I had an email from a woman who took my class in 1978, something like that, and said that some comment I made about zoos back then changed her life. She's got grandkids, no, she's kids now, and or maybe even grandkids. And one of them just said to her something about zoos, and she remembered this lecture I gave in my animal behavior class that was questioning zoos. So that made me feel good. I mean, this was a long time ago. There's been a lot of turnover in the RNA in both of our brains. So she had this memory of it, and it really pleased me, and I work with Jane Goodall a lot, and she had the same, she had to face the same kinds of criticisms when she came out of the field, and she named her chimpanzees and talked about their unique personalities. She was told that that's anti-science and you're being anthropomorphic, and Jane just persisted, clearly, to this day. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, although I didn't know her back then, in some ways she was a model for me, but my mentor for my PhD was a real model. The minute animals came into a lab, because they were rescued animals, they were named immediately. And so I loved a lot of the animals I studied. The minute they came in, I go, "Oh, you're a Mary. Oh, you're an Ellen. Oh, you're a Harry. You're a Bertram." I mean, it was just, and the minute you name an animal, you are tied into them. We don't, mm-hmm. we name our companion animals, at least most normal people do. You don't number them. So, anyway, so I'm just rambling on. It's been a long journey. It's been a long journey, and I don't know that I've suffered that much from my animal protection views, and I frankly don't care.
Well, thank goodness you haven't cared, and that you've been brave enough to stick your neck out and advocate, and the same with Dr. Goodall, because can't imagine, if that hadn't happened, the less we would learn. I wonder too what you think of, this argument about, you talk a lot about the emotional lives of animals, and certainly many animals share many emotions and cognitive attributes that we do. So what do you think when people say that anthropomorphism isn't helping, that it's, not a good way to gain insight?
Well, I don't even talk about that anymore. If people say you're being anthropomorphic, I just said, fine, do you have anything else to say? I mean, we need to use the language with which we're most familiar. I'm very clear to say that dog joy and elephant joy and chimpanzee joy and snake joy maybe aren't all the same. And my joy and your joy and my grief and your grief may not be the same, but it doesn't mean I have it and you don't, or you have it and I don't. So I'm very clear about the fact that we have certain words that we use, and that's what we really need to focus on. And for years, I put forth what I call biocentric anthropomorphism, meaning focusing on the animal who you're talking about, and taking into account, not only who they are as a member of a species, but who they are as an individual. And anybody who questions whether dogs enjoy playing or whether elephants and chimpanzees and other animals grieve is totally out of touch with reality and science. I mean, just really totally out of touch. So am I being anthropomorphic? Well, I guess I am. Next. I mean, that's really how I feel about it. I don't talk about it anymore. And because it's useless. Because usually the people who say that, oh, you're being anthropomorphic are coming at it from the point of view of denying, being rich denialists. And one example I give involved an elephant at a zoo years ago, where the elephant was standing, chained, and rocking back and forth. And I said, "Oh, look at her. She's just so unhappy." And the guy I was with, who was the conservation and the zoo guy, said, "How could you say that? She's happy." And it got really quiet. And I said, "How come I'm being anthropomorphic when I say she's not happy, and you're not being anthropomorphic when you say she's happy?" That was the end of the conversation. And that was it. So a lot of the critics, the other thing that's important to mention with people who work at zoos, but it also applies to a lot of people who study non-humans, is a lot of these people have never seen those animals in the wild. I know that. I don't mean that as a criticism, really, but they've never seen a wild elephant or a wild wolf or a wild whoever is in a cage. So that could be a part of their education system, that if they can't travel to see these animals, watch some really great documentaries that are available on the web, easily available. So, and then I just have heard over the years, you write about some aspect of behavior. They're saying, well, no, they don't perform that. And I'm thinking, my goodness, I used to see that 5 times a week in the wild coyotes, and so go watch the video.
Right. Yeah, we should recognize that not everyone can go get to see these animals in the wild, but that shouldn't limit their ability to understand and educate themselves from all the researchers out there, all the books written about them. Right. It reminds me of an interesting comment that I heard about, kids need to see the animals in order to care about them. And a colleague in the movement had said, but what about dinosaurs? How many kids are fascinated by dinosaurs? They never had the opportunity to see them up close.
No, I mean, it's great to see them, but my goodness gracious, I mean, you could go on the web right now and just do a search for whatever animal you're interested in and find footage of their natural behavior. Yeah, I mean, you just can. So It's not as good as seeing them in real, but a lot of these animals live in places where very few people will ever get to go. I mean, I consider myself really, really fortunate to have been able to see penguins in Antarctica and elephants in Africa and wolves in Yellowstone. I do. I mean, I don't take it for granted, but they can see a lot of that, these animals in action, and get a good feeling for who they are and what they do. So go do it. And it gets back to your question on education. It should be mandatory for people to take Lizard 101 or Elephant 101 or whatever, really, before they ever become responsible for the very lives of these animals. I mean, because they are, animals in zoos are being cared for by people, a lot of people who really care about them. I don't doubt that, but you've got to know a lot about them too. So you can combine the caring for them with the knowledge, and not these stupid speciesist things as they're only snakes or they're only birds or something like that.
Do you think knowledge is one of the biggest barriers for us moving forward? Because a lot of the research the World Animal Protection has conducted has found that, many of the people participating in some, interactive activities with wild animals are self-proclaimed animal lovers. Like, they're just as passionate about looking at those bugs in the dirt. They want these animals in their homes for a reason. They love them. They find them fascinating. Is it just that they don't understand that they're actually harming the animal, do you think?
Oh, I do. I don't doubt that they love the animals. Like I said, I always say I'm glad they don't love me, because if they love me, I'd like them to find out more about what Mark needs or what you need or somebody else needs. But I don't doubt that. But that's the easy part. You love these animals, so learn more about them. You love them, you want them in your home, so learn what they need. To me, it's a no-brainer, But the knowledge should come before you bring them home. the return rate, and that's what I call it. It's like, you get something from Amazon and you don't like it, so you send it back, is really high for a lot of these pocket pets, they call them. I hate that phrase, but, they're small, or they're invertebrates, or they're fishes, and, they don't really care if they've had 5 homes, or they don't really care if they're kept in a little glass cage in a zoo. They do care. They care very, very much. So the knowledge should come before. And and because I work so closely with and do so much work with dogs now, I just talk to people. And especially when people say, "Oh, I think I'll get a dog. What do you think?" And I'll say, "Do you know what it takes to get a dog? Do you know what it'll mean when you bring a dog into your home and your heart?" And we have these conversations, and thank goodness a lot of them reflect on it and then decide not to, which is good. But it's a lot easier to do with these animals, for whom you assume they're not sentient. They're sentient, but your behavior shows the opposite, that you begin to say, well, they don't really care how they're treated, or or they don't really care whether they have certain things in their lives that they need so that they can perform some natural behaviors.
And for some of those, well, I don't know if it's a pocket pet. I guess I'm assuming a pocket pet is more like a gerbil, or
gerbil, guinea pig, rat, mouse.
Not a snake. Then I would hope.
I would hope too, but I kind of used it, as a phrase where it's just a little animal who you could just possibly slide in your pocket or throw in your backpack.
Okay, because I'm thinking snakes have just grown in popularity as pets, and you see them sold as beginner pets, or beginner. That's the other phrase. Yeah, so I don't know where to place the blame. I guess that could be shared on a lot of people. We all have to take responsibility. But if your only way of seeing a snake, if you're not fortunate to look and go for a hike in the woods and see them, if you're seeing them mostly in zoos in these tiny containers and they're being promoted in stores as a beginner pet, then is that a big part of the problem?
It's a huge part of the problem. I mean, what's a beginner pet? I mean, I can see you're going to go play tennis, ride a bike, or learn something, and you might fall off, or you do something. But beginner pet is just the most insulting thing you could ever imagine saying. Yeah, I think I'll begin with you, and then as I learn more about you and what you as an individual, because you've got to stress the individuality of these animals, but you as an individual and you as a member of a given species need, then maybe I'll get some more and I'll know more, and maybe I'll have a better life. Someone said to me, "I want you to be a beginner human." I would think, I don't think so.
It's pretty insulting, yes.
Thank you for your interest in me as a beginner human, but I don't think that I need to come live in your house in a cage or have a leash, and a collar put on me. But I really do mean that. I had never heard of that phrase, and I find it to be just disgusting. It's so abusive and leads to abuse.
Yeah, and if, trusted sources of information are calling these animals beginner pets, or, for instance, snake equipment, there's some that are promoted by National Geographic as a snake habitat, a typical vivarium. So if people are seeing credible brands that they associate with, wildlife in the wild and wildlife protection or animal protection, and they're getting this information there, I can see where there's that disconnect, where sure, everyone needs to take responsibility and step back and think about the animal they want to bring in their home. That doesn't that is still a very important thing, but it's unfortunate that people they trust are still promoting these mixed messages about the simple lives of these animals, which we know from your research and books and other researchers that they have very complex lives.
Yeah, that's a topic for another seminar, if you will, but I do agree with you. I used to say consider the source, but now I'm a little I'm leery of that, because there are some organizations. I mean, it gets back to what I said about maybe some zoological conservation organizations who do good stuff, But you got to be really careful with big organizations because they're multi-layered. And it's not that they're against the animals. It's just, frankly, some of them haven't even thought about it. I mean, I've had a little go with National Geographic about certain things that they put out, like, you know, these killer shark movies and tuna fishing. I just don't get it. And I've been very overt about it. And usually I never hear from them. So I always tell people, don't believe everything that you hear, even if it comes from an organization that has the word wildlife or conservation in it. And it's true. It's just true.
Maybe we need to think more critically like a child. And you've mentioned a lot about children giving you some hope. Are you generally more hopeful about the future for animals?
I am, because I'm a kind of an innate optimist, but I have to say that I go up and down on it, but I'm really a glass 7/8 full, not half full person.
That's pretty good.
Well, from some of my work with kids, it's really reinforced that, because a story I've told a lot is I was working with this 6-year-old girl and some of her friends on some project, and we started talking about animal protection and different things. And somebody one of her friends made a negative comment, and I said, well, you know, there's always hope. And this girl, I can't remember her name, said something that should be a bumper sticker. She said, why should I work on this if there's no hope? So it's true. If you tell a 6-year-old that what you're doing is going to make no difference in the end, then they're not dumb. They're going to look at you and go, well, why should I do this? I might as well go play jump rope or baseball or whatever, you know, game they're playing. So I get a lot of energy from these young kids in terms of their hope, and they haven't been tainted. The educational system, no 6-year-old has been told, oh, you're just being anthropomorphic and compassionate and sentimental. I mean, seriously, you know, but people are as they get older. Oh, you're just fluffy. Oh, you're sentimental. Oh, you're just too compassionate, you know. So the bottom line is, yes, I am, because if I weren't hopeful, then I could think of a lot of other things to do. But I am hopeful, and I'm hopeful by talks like this, where people who are on the ground working in zoos or working in laboratories or slaughterhouses or laboratories or wherever animals are routinely and horrifically abused, that people are really coming out and having these frank discussions. And I'm just over if you will, the shades of gray. I mean, sometimes there's a shade of gray, but I'm over that, because the minute you get into that slippery slope of gray, it's so easy to justify something. And so, you know, my bottom line is stop the killing, stop the harming, stop the zooing, if you will. And I know it's going to take time, but you got to start sometime. And I hate when people go, well, we'll do it later. No, you won't. No, you won't. So do it now. No more captive breeding. No more shipping animals around as mating machines. No more taking animals in who you know nothing about. No more beginner animals at zoos. No more beginner pets. And asking people nicely, because I think you got to be nice to people with whom you disagree, to listen to you and to justify what they're doing. I really mean that. And you stop captive breeding, stop killing animals like Marius the giraffe and these, I call it zoothanasia. They'll say, well, we had to euthanize 9 lion cubs because they didn't fit into our breeding program or we didn't have room for them. It's not euthanasia, it's zoothanasia. No more killing innocent animals because they don't fit into your breeding program. So people go, well, we'll run out of space. And I'll say, well, too bad. Close down the breeding, work with the animals you have, and then as you as you create spaces, use them for rehabilitating animals who you've rescued who need your help.
Thank you, Dr. Bekoff. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you this last hour. Really appreciate your time teaching us, sharing your opinions, and thanks so much for your advocacy for animals.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for for all you're doing. Like I said, these are the sorts of things we really need to do. We really do, and I just think that it's our obligation to put out what we know and don't know, and it's our obligation to inform people of what lies beneath the surface, if you will. And always doing it in a nice way. I mean, I don't see any reason to get into pissing matches with people with whom I disagree. It's a waste of time. The minute they go on the defensive, then you're done. You might as well just go home. And so I just really think putting it out there and not wasting time with people who are not going to change. I really believe that because there's just so many individuals who need our help right today. So thank you for all you do.
Oh, those are great tips and great words to end with. Thank you.
So thank you for that. I also neglected to introduce Melissa Matlow, who was doing the interviewing with Dr. Bekoff. Mel is our campaign director here at the Canadian Office for Wildland Protection. So that was a really fascinating interview, and really appreciate all of you who have stuck with us through to the end of today. So just some closing remarks. We want to thank you again for attending today's webinar. And we hope that you will see you at next week's session on October 14th. If this is your last registered session, please take a minute and fill out our post-event survey, as this feedback is really valuable to us as we continue on. And you'll receive a link in the post-event survey. You'll receive a link to the post-event survey. And then lastly, and this was a question that was asked way back at the beginning of this session a couple of hours ago. Recordings and resources are going to become available in early November for you. So you will have all this available to you. So thanks again. Thanks for sticking with us, and have a fantastic rest of your day.